Number 10, Battle of LA. Remember the 1940s? Okay, well, maybe not. I mean, if you did, then you might not be watching this video, or you would need assistance from a strapping young grandson such as myself to help you with searching on the internet and whatnot. It's okay, I help the old people. That's what I do. Well, for the folks that didn't know, the world was at war, and passions were a little high. America, in a nutshell, said they weren't getting involved the second time around until Japan came, well, they kicked their sandcastle over. And by sandbox, I mean they made Pearl Harbor go boom. So naturally, a few months after the Pearl Harbor incident in February of 1942, the lovely west coast city of LA was put into shock and horror when unidentified flying objects appeared in the night sky. Air raid sirens blared and anti-aircraft artillery began to light up the night sky, as this was suspected to be a Japanese invasion. Well, it wasn't actually. It was actually a false alarm, so no need to panic, right? Maybe. Number 9, the chosen few. In the beginning of the Cold War, it was clear that the West had some spooky, scary communist enemies to deal with. And almost immediately after the world had sent Germany packing, the Soviet Union was acting up. And then China, and then Korea. Well, that was it. We had it. The West of America had enough of communism spreading. It was time to contain it. So American and UN forces went to Korea to have a discussion at the 38th parallel. One group of Marines at the Chosin Valley had a chewy perspective of the event. When this group of Marines at Chosin Valley radioed in for a supply drop, they used the code word Tootsie Rolls, as it was a code for mortar shells that they so desperately needed. Well, apparently the radio operator didn't get the memo and had an actual crate of Halloween's second least favorite candy scent. Besides candy corn, no one likes that stuff. But being the Marines, they used it to their advantage. And after being chewed up and placed over holes and gaps, the chocolatey treat made for a great filler, especially after freezing in the freezing cold weather at Chosin Valley. Cool story. Number 8, Operation Cottage. If you heard the title Operation Cottage and thought that maybe Canadians were involved in the process, then you would be correct. Unfortunately, this was a battle between Canadians and Americans during WW2. Back in 1942, Imperial Japanese Marines had landed a force in Alaska at Kiska Island. That alone is terrifying. You know, they were so close. America and Canada, finding out about this, were naturally alarmed. So in 1943, they sent some men to take care of the issue. When the Allies landed, a firefight ensued. Naturally, it's WW2, it happens. And both Canadians and Americans had casualties. The trouble is, it wasn't the Japanese. They had abandoned their post a few weeks earlier, as they deemed it was too difficult to defend, and it's Alaska. It's too cold. Anyone from that area could tell you the same. As it turns out, it was Americans and Canadians firing upon each other in a case of mistaken identity. Or not so friendly fire. Number 7, Charge at Creasy. The charge at Creasy can be described as a Hail Mary. One final push. The last card. It's a 1v6 and search and destroy on high rise in Modern Warfare 2. Bottom of the 9th and bases are loaded. If Hollywood has taught us anything in life, it's that these events always work out for our hero. Well, sometimes real life isn't like Hollywood movies. Take John of Bohemia for instance, your classic 1300s guy. Marrying his way into royalty, a warrior, a knight, except poor John was blind in one eye due to a medical condition. Poor John. Well, at the Battle of Creasy, his bravery was put on full display. John had his horses tethered to other knights, because he was blind, as they made their last effort dash into the enemy, or charge if you will. They didn't make it. It didn't work out. Kind of crazy, like, right, I'm blind and what I'm going to do is, I'm going to tie your horse to my horse, and we're going to run straight at the enemy. Number 6, Napoleon in Moscow. During the Corsican Ogre's European tour, he let himself into Russia. More specifically, he made it all the way to Moscow. This was impressive for a couple of reasons. One, because he had defeated other European powers with really little effort, and he was about to defeat Russia. Finger quotes. About to defeat Russia. Back in the day, there was this notion that if you control the nation's capital, you win. Well, he had Moscow, but it was more of a Pyrrhic victory. Russia had enacted a military tactic called Scorched Earth, and it wouldn't be the last time they used it. Basically, back in the day, militaries relied heavily on the lands they took for resources, food, shelter, and supply lines. Well, you can't control that if there's no land to take. So Russia destroyed their land, food, fields, and really anything that would have been helpful along the way as they retreated. Also, the winters were very brutal and cold, and the French were not prepared. So mix that together and uh-oh, awkward. Number 5, the Battle of Mogadishu. Here's a modern one for you. It was a simple job. Grab 2 high-value targets, known collaborators of a corrupt Somali leader who's basically just a dictator. Things were going great until 2 $6 million Black Hawk helicopters were downed by enemies on the ground. An in-and-out operation that was supposed to last no longer than an hour. Tops, I swear, I promise. It actually turned out to be an overnight 16-hour rescue op that saw 18 Americans lose their life, known as the Black Hawk Down situation, or operation I guess. So what's the lesson on this one? Well, I'm not really sure to be honest, but what I do know is that it left a mark on 90s history and American military snafus. Uh-oh. Number 4, Mattel 16. The 1960s saw a lot of technological development. The extensive use of the helicopter comes to mind. During the early years of the Vietnam War, Americans were issued a brand new rifle. The M16 was a brand new design that flopped as hard as it could, as it tended not to work, which, if you're in a war, is kind of not what you want to happen. Your stuff's kind of gotta work. A rumor had spread around that the firearm never needed to be cleaned, which in a jungle setting with mud and rain just doesn't make any sense. This, with already existing flaws, made it jam and was rendered useless by soldiers. Nicknamed the Mattel 16 after the toy company, some soldiers were forced to use enemy weapons, which sadly in some cases may have led to fatal incidents of friendly fire. Number 3, Stirling Bridge. There was one time growing up I had a super important test to take at school. I don't remember what class it was, but I remember studying extra hard for it. I mean seriously, I opened the books and I hit them hard, brother. Harder than my little heart could desire. Studied my little heart out. It was really hard, Chris. And now I'm thinking about it, it's probably math. Anyway, well, when I went to bed, I knew that I was going to be ready for that test. The trouble is, I woke up at 9:57. School started at 8:30. Not only did I miss the test, but when I retook it, I didn't do as well as I thought. Well, this is the case of the Battle of Stirling Bridge, except there wasn't really any awkward high school stuff going on. It was more of a serious battle for independence. The very famous William Wallace and the Scottish were at odds with the English, as you'll find in history they do that. Well, that morning the British general slept in, and Wallace, seeing an opportunity, seized it, and seized the day and victory for Scotland. The lesson here? Set your alarm, folks. Don't miss the battle. Set your alarm. Number 2, Operation Cottage. Canada and the US have been friends for a very long time, and we will probably be friends for a very long time. We have apologized profusely for burning down the White House. We're sorry, eh? Didn't mean to do that, bud. I'm sorry there, guy. Sorry, friend. Jeez. However, did you know that in a classic World War II military snafu, Canadians and US soldiers fought each other? Kiska Island, Alaska. It had been occupied by a small group of Japanese forces, which is kind of a weird story on its own. How did that even happen? So we went to go kindly ask them to leave, as you do. Trouble is, when we got there were no Japanese, and in a very confusing battle after landing on 2 different points of the island, our 2 great nations fought each other where sadly lives were lost. It was rough. It was sad. It was like 30 Americans and like 4 Canadians. I don't know if we're just good shots or what. I don't know what it is, buddy. Number 1, Bull Run. The Civil War. It's the one that shaped America. Brother versus brother. And it's what your dad reads about in his spare time. I don't know, dads just do that. Bull Run is one of the most famous battles from the time. However, I don't want to focus on the battle itself, as I've nerded out too hard in history already today in this video. No! Why am I talking about this, and why is this in the number 1 spot? Well, that's because of spectators. Yes, that's right, spectators. Wealthy folks would often come to large battles like Bull Run on a decent vantage point out of the splash zone, literally, and view the ensuing horror that was the Civil War. And before you even ask, yes, they brought food and a picnic to enjoy the show. Maybe don't watch that. Just an idea. Next time. Yeah, oh well.
Kicking off the list at number 10, Goose Green Battle. Although the British were taking on large numbers of Argentinian soldiers, their unit, outnumbered, still came out on top. The Battle of Goose Green took place on May 28th and May 29th, 1982. It ended with over 900 Argentine soldiers surrendering. It was a rocky start to the operation, to say the least. Argentinian forces were ready when the British arrived. The main assault force was the 2nd Battalion Parachute Regiment, led by Lieutenant Colonel Herbert Jones, but BBC Radio straight up spoiled the surprise initially. At the time, they were broadcasting news as was happening, morning of the Goose Green attack. The Argentinian forces were tipped off, and then when the attack was finally underway come the morning of May 28th, Jones sadly lost his life heroically charging at the enemy post. The Argentinian garrison formally surrendered the following morning, and the late Herbert Jones received, as well as his successor of the battalion, Major Chris Keeble, they were both awarded medals. Jones received the Victoria Cross, while Keeble received the Distinguished Service Order. Two para were outnumbered and should have lost when comparing support, but they ended up taking down the entire Argentine garrison, more than twice their own size. Number 9. Bluff Cove. On June 8, 1982, British troop transport ships were attacked from the skies. Argentine air forces took the lives of 56 soldiers and wounding 150. British troops were in the middle of unloading when two waves of A-4 Skyhawks from Argentina's 5th Air Brigade attacked. The Skyhawks departed from Rio Gallegos Air Base, and originally 8 of them were on the way, but 3 had to turn back due to refueling issues. With warning signals not reaching Bluff Cove, around 2 p.m. local time, the first strike hit 2 ships, the RFA Tristram and the RFA Sir Galahad. At 4:50 p.m. local time, the second strike hit. This one sank an LSU from HMS Fearless.
Number 8. The Football War. It started with the leaders of Honduras and El Salvador. There was some agriculture and land disputes growing, and the leader of Honduras made it worse by using El Salvador migrants as scapegoats for their problems. Classic dictator move, am I right? Come on. Tensions kept getting hotter to the point where people were being treated differently, and that's not good. And because history is a funny thing, the 1970 World Cup at the time was going to be played by the both feuding nations. The passion, the rage, the anger, the music, they got good music down there, was poured into that game. Well, it was enough for El Salvador to cut all diplomatic ties and after the game declare war outside of the soccer stadium. For real. People got hurt. It wasn't good. Man, that's rough.
Number 7. Battle of Mount Harriet. Taking place in the late hours of June 11th, 1982, the Battle of Mount Harriet is one of the 3 main battles that took place during the Falklands War. And they happened all on the same night. I keep saying the dates also just to really drive that information into your head, but these operations went down roughly at the same exact time. The British had 42 Commando, Royal Marines, artillery support from a battery of 29 Commando Regiment, and Royal Artillery. British war correspondent John Witherow recalls the naval support at the Battle of Mount Harriet as blistering. Here's a quote from Witherow on the evening of June 11th, 1982. "We were involved with one night attack on Mount Harriet when the Welsh's guards were coming up as backup. This involved marching for several hours on a very dark night through a minefield. Sporadic shell fire slowed our progress tremendously, and eventually we made a base out of Mount Harriet, which was coming under incredible fire from a frigate offshore. The whole mountain seemed to erupt in flame. It seemed impossible that anybody could survive an attack like that. And this went on for well over an hour, just shell after shell whistling over our heads and hitting the mountain. Eventually this was lifted and Marines went in. And to our amazement, there seemed to be an incredible amount of fighting going on. There was a lot of tracer fire. The whole night was being lit up by flares, which cast a dead, unrealistic pall over the whole scene." End quote. 26 soldiers were wounded, and both Corporal Lawrence G. Watts and Acting Corporal Jeremy Smith lost their lives in the Battle of Mount Harriet. Number 6. Mount Longden. One of the most violent firefights of the Falklands War was the Battle of Mount Longden. The night of June 11th, 1982, many recall as one of the most horrifying. 23 members of the Parachute Regiment lost their lives while 47 others were injured. Veteran James O'Connell was 22 years old at the time. He recalls being at death's door. "I had dressings covering my face to stop the blood, and I remember being loaded onto a stretcher. I heard one of the guys carrying me saying, 'This one's alive,' and the others say, 'Is he? Well, let's take him back then.' There was a makeshift mortuary, and I think I was being taken there to be placed with the dead." End quote. He was literally on his way. I can't imagine what that feels like in numerous ways. O'Connell was hit in the head and face. A bullet went through his nose and right eye, just went through his cheekbone entirely. And on top of that, they couldn't even get helicopters to Mount Longden for 12 hours, so O'Connell, as well as many others injured, had to just wait it out. The British forces consisted of 3rd Battalion, artillery support from 29 Commando Regiment, Royal Artillery, Parachute Regiment 3 Para under Lieutenant Colonel Hugh Pike. Number 5. Battle of Two Sisters. The third battle that took place on the night of June 11th was the Battle of Two Sisters. This battle, as well as Mount Harriet and Mount Longden, were brigade-sized operations that all happened, remind you, on the same night. The British were commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Whitehead, and the support consisted of Royal Marines of 45 Commando, the anti-tank troop from 40 Commando, with support from 29 Commando Regiment and naval support from the HMM Glamran. Originally, 45 Commando was to seize Two Sisters Mountain overnight, hiding in the darkness, and if there was enough time, time, used said darkness to advance onto Tumbledown Mountain. Argentine forces were ready, so the second phase of the attack was unable to happen as they wanted to. In total, 22 British soldiers lost their lives, a destroyer was hit, as well as 3 helicopters, 22 were killed with 47 wounded.
Number 4, the Emu War. Australia, a land of beautiful landscapes, sunshine, and an accent that I'm trying to master. It's not that easy. All crocodile hunters aside, they are infamous for a battle of biblical proportions, something that was so huge and magnificent it for sure had to be talked about. It's the Emu War. Yes, that's right, the Aussies went to war with emus, and they lost. Okay, hold on. Before I get blooming onions thrown at me, let me explain. Basically, the Great Depression was hard for Australia. It was hard for everybody, but especially them. It was rough. Even rougher was emus destroying their crops. Really bad. So bad, the farmers called upon the government, who then called upon the army, who then called upon a couple of dudes with a truck and a machine gun to deal with it. Trouble is, they were just too darn good at dodging gunfire. The emus, that is. One politician jokingly said, the emus should be given medals for their bravery. I don't even know about that one. I don't even know. That's just, okay, they missed. I guess they missed.
Number 3, HMS Sheffield. The Type 42 guided missile destroyer was the second Royal Navy ship to be named after the city of Sheffield, Yorkshire. In response to the Argentine invasion, Sheffield was sent to retake the islands on April 2nd, 1982. Captain Salt had ordered the ship to change course every 90 seconds to avoid submarine threat. The 2 weeks prior to the attack, Argentine forces were training against their own ships, which happened to include Type 42 destroyers, the same class as the HMS Sheffield. So they knew the radar detection distances and their reaction times like the back of their hand at this point. They used a technique called pecking the lobes, which meant that they would avoid detection by flying on the side of the emitting radar, out of sight. The destroyer was hit on May 4th and foundered while under tow 6 days later on May 10th. Number 2, the Battle of Seal Cove. Just west of Lively Island during the Falklands War, the Battle of Seal Cove was also underway. On May 22, the British frigates HMS Brilliant and HMS Yarmouth were supporting Operation Sutton. This was happening right off of San Carlos Bay when they received orders to stop and take over an Argentinian coastal supply boat, the ARA Monsunan. It was a 326-ton British coaster that had previously been owned by the Falkland Islands Company, but during the invasions, the ship was captured. It was also loaded with 150 drums of fuel and 250 sacks of flour. The HMS Yarmouth opened fire and forced that vessel to beach on Seal Cove. And finally, coming in at number 1, young soldiers. It's important to remember how young these brave soldiers were at the time. I wanted to finish this list off by sharing the words of a Royal Navy veteran who was only a teenager during the Falklands War. Craig Mac McDermott was 17 at the time. Craig was on the HMS Antrim in 1982 when conflict took off. The actual location of the Falkland Islands is different than most expect. Craig explains his initial thoughts at the time. He shared this in the Daily Record last November. When I first heard of the Falkland Islands, like many people, I thought they were just off the north of Scotland. I didn't know where they were, but there's no way I will ever forget them after everything I've witnessed. We were naive and too young to understand the severity of what we were about to encounter. The air attacks were constant and there were several injured during each of the attacks. The suffering was indescribable and something that I'll never be able to forget. Thank you for your service, Craig.
Number 10, Marathon. The Battle of Marathon took place in 490 BC during the first Persian invasion of Greece. It was fought between the citizens of Athens and Plateau together as one force to defend against the Persian army commanded by Datis and Artis Phernes. The battle was the culmination of the first attempt by Persia under King Darius I to subjugate Greece. The Greek army, the underdog in this, inflicted an embarrassing defeat on the many more Persians, marking a turning point in the Greco-Persian Wars. Roughly 25,000 Persians against 10,000 Greeks. I'm on Team Greece, because they're clearly the underdog here, and the victors. Also safe to say Greece's confidence skyrocketed after this victory. King Darius the Great and his army fled with their tails between their legs. This battle was a response to Athens and Greeks being done underneath Persian rule. Yeah, they're like, you know what, we're out, okay dude, we're done. So Darius the Great took great vengeance upon the Athenians, which didn't really work out so well for him. Number 9, Thermopylae. Cut to part 2 of the same series, the Battle of Thermopylae. This was fought 10 years later in 480 BC between the Persian Empire again, this time under Xerxes I, and now Sparta under Leonidas I. Yeah, they were still pissed and wanted some more hands, so they came back. Basically, Greece's Navy SEALs decided to jump in this time. And the Greco-Persian Wars continued. Only lasted about 3 days, actually. Yeah, those Spartans, they're good. We're familiar with this tale as old as time. 300 Spartans held off like 300,000 Persians. Yeah, little more this time. They were definitely not bluff, but neither was the 900 Spartans and rebels. There was one path in, which was Thermopylae, and the Spartans did not let them by. "You shall not pass!" And they didn't. If you haven't seen 300, watch it. It's an amazing movie.
Number 8, Vimy Ridge. I learned about this in school and my history teacher was so excited to tell me about it, and I'm still excited about it today. This battle is the reason Canadian soldiers earned their notoriety during World War I. The Battle of Vimy Ridge remains a testament to expert organization and strategy. From April 9th to 12th in 1917, 4 divisions of the Canadian Corps captured Vimy Ridge from the Germans, making the largest territorial advance made by any Allied force in the war. The losses were significant, resulting in 10,000 men either killed or wounded, so it wasn't the easiest win. However, through their meticulous planning and secret operations, they were able to break the stalemate between the Allied and enemy forces. Soldiers, before they were sent over, actually trained on a replica of Vimy Ridge, so they were like well rehearsed when they showed up. They knew Vimy Ridge like the back of their hand. Meanwhile, at Vimy Ridge, 11 tunnels were constructed in secret to bring the first wave out safely in front of German lines. Each tunnel was also equipped with lighting, water supplies, and first aid. Behind front lines, the soldiers moved in well-rehearsed timed attacks based on where Allied and enemy trenches were marked. Vimy Ridge marked a change in military tactic and highlighted the heroic nature of Canadian soldiers. Yeah, Vimy Ridge is kind of like a big deal over here. It's kind of cool. It wasn't just Canadians, they were like British soldiers too. But, you know, take it where you can get it.
Number 7. The Battle of Hastings. This battle was fought between Alexander the Great and King Porus in 326 BC. These guys scrapped hard. The fourth and the last battle in the conquest of Asia for Alex. Yeah, this one took a toll on him. It took place on the banks of the Hastings River in India, subcontinent modern-day Pakistan. The battle resulted in a Greek victory after the surrender of Porus. Scraping by, it seems. Yeah, after conquering the Persian Empire, Alexander got cocky and thought he could just waltz into northern India without a fight. The forces were pretty even too. Alexander had more cavalry, but Porus had his secret weapons as well. 200 war elephants. That's the most badass thing I've ever heard. Imagine seeing a giant walking tank with tusks just chucking bodies and horses out into the sky. There's literally nothing more intimidating. No wonder Alexander barely won. When asked by Alexander how he wished to be treated, Porus said, "As a king would treat another king." Impressed, Alex, now king, allowed him to retain some of Porus's land. He renamed 2 cities, however, one called Nicaea, Greek for victory, and one after his horse. Yeah, talk about salt in the wound, dude. Number 6. Cannae. The Battle of Cannae was a key move in the Second Punic War between the Roman Republic and Carthage, fought on August 2nd, 216 BC, near the ancient village of Cannae. The Carthaginians and their allies, led by our hero Hannibal, not Hannibal Lecter, just Hannibal. One name. Well, he surrounded and practically annihilated the superior Roman and Italian army. It's known as one of the greatest tactical feats in military history, equally one of the most embarrassing by the Romans. I mean, the Romans were good. Literally a walking tank with shields and spears. They were practically unbeatable. But they rushed into Cannae and Hannibal flanked the shit out of them. Yeah, him and a stew of about 50,000 rebel towns and cities, trapping the Roman army inside the city, who were then annihilated. Only about 15,000 Romans. Not a huge loss, but back at home, they were starting to panic, and the Romans started doing anything and everything they could to rebuild an army. It's forever known as a legendary and almost defined feat. Number 5. Hastings. The Battle of Hastings was fought on October 14th, 1066 between the Norman-French army of William Duke of Normandy and the English army under the Anglo-Saxon king Harold Godwinson. It took place approximately northwest of Hastings, which is present-day Sussex. A decisive yet Norman victory. The English army was almost all infantry and had few archers, whereas the French were an even half and half. The Normans did this really funny tactic where they'd pretend to flee in panic and then turn around and flank their pursuers. It worked every time. Most of the blame for the defeat lies in the structure of the battle. William was a more experienced military leader. He liked structure. Basically, when Harold heard that William had landed in England, he rushed south instead of taking his time to build a strong and large army. The English played offense way too much and got broken to bits. Harold's death led to the retreat and defeat of the English army. William was crowned as king on Christmas Day 1066.
Number 4, Castle Itter. Okay, good guys wear one outfit, bad guys wear another. If the soldier in front of you sounds German and it's World War II, then it's probably the enemy. Chances are. It all makes sense, right? Well, the Battle of Castle Itter makes no sense. When World War II was coming to its climactic close, Americans and Allied forces were coming from the west, and all of Mother Russia was coming from the east. A lot of Germans fought to the bitter end, but the smart ones knew it was time to jump ship. You can see it was falling apart. And in the case of Castle Itter, they actually joined forces with Americans and Allies to defend high-value prisoners from an SS detachment who still thought Germany could win. Spoiler alert, they could not win. It was over, and the joint force would see a victory. That's kind of cool. That's a cool story. Again, where's the movie of that? Where's the movie? Put me in the movie. Someone make me famous. Let's go. Hollywood directors, I'm talking to you.
Number 3. Agincourt. The Battle of Agincourt was an English victory in the 100 Years' War. It took place October 25th, 1415 in northern France. The unexpected English victory against the numerically superior French army boosted English morale and prestige while simultaneously crippling France. King Henry V of England led his troops into battle against King Charles VI of France, although he wasn't actually there, because he was a little cuckoo at the time. Yeah, couldn't really be trusted on the field. Lots of knights and swords and stuff, you know? That's all I gotta say. This battle is notorious for archers. They won this war, hands down. The Battle of Agincourt is one of England's most celebrated victories to date. It's a history in itself, as it forms the backdrop to William Shakespeare's play, Henry V. Number 2. Orleans. And again, cut to part 2 of the same 100 Years' War thing. The Siege of Orleans, aka Battle of Orleans, was fought October 1428 to May 1429. Again, between France and England. Yeah, they hated each other. From 1428 to 1429, it was the French Royal Army's first major military victory to follow their crushing defeat at Agincourt years earlier. A true grudge match. A young woman mounted on a white horse like a Valkyrie riding into Valhalla. 17-year-old Joan of Arc, the medium knight hybrid, chosen by God to lead the French to victory. Why aren't there like 38 movies about her? Like really? Under the Treaty of Troyes of 1420, England's Henry V became regent of France. By his treaty, Henry married Catherine, the daughter of the current French king Charles VI, and would then succeed to the French throne, cancelling out the Dauphin of France, also Charles. Oh yeah, the old switcheroo, huh? That chessboard of crowns, I tell you, just everywhere. Months of battles under the divine Joan led France to victory. The Dauphin crowned as King Charles VII of France, the hero, here being Joan, of course, who was later tried as a witch and hanged. The whole hearing God in your head thing kind of freaked people out. And coming in the number 1 spot, Gettysburg. A little bit of a time gap, but it's one of the most prolific and bloody battles to ever happen on this planet. The American Civil War, North versus South. The Battle of Gettysburg, 1863, the town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Union versus Confederate. Union Army led by General George Meade and Ulysses S. Grant defeated attacks by Confederate General Robert E. Lee's army, halting Lee's invasion to the north and retreat back down south. Yeah, just to throw some numbers at you here, about 650,000 Americans died due to this war. It's pretty disgusting, but necessary, as the North was reprimanding the South, ridding it, and standing up against its archaic and dehumanization ideologies. The two armies collided at Gettysburg 1863 as Lee and Meade took turns firing cannon after cannon at each other. Lee led his army on a torturous retreat back to Virginia after the loss, resulting between 45,000 and 60,000 soldiers from both armies perishing in just 3 days. The most costly in US history from battles. Safe to say Grant and Meade were the heroes, and Lee, well, definitely the villain. On November 19th, President Lincoln used the dedication ceremony for the Gettysburg National Cemetery to honor the fallen Union soldiers who gave their life fighting tirelessly for the freedoms of every American.
Number 10, the Siege of Orleans. Or Orleans. As history would have it, the French and English were at each other's arms again. Oh, who would have thought? It's a very common trend in history, except this time, France was losing really badly, like super badly. So one day when a young peasant girl walked into the king's throne room and said, "Bro, I got this. A godly angel vision sent me here to fight back and rid France of the English." Running low on everything, including men, the king agreed. The siege of Orleans was to be the final nail in the coffin for France until Joan of Arc showed up. She led the army to victory against the English. They were stunned and she became a hero overnight. It's a good thing not too long after that they burned her at the stake for being a witch. Very nice. No, it's not nice, it's horrible. God, can't have anything nice. Number 9, the Battle of Waterloo. The Corsican ogre, Napoleon Bonaparte. His military career is most impressive, maybe the most impressive out of any military leader to have ever lived. You gotta watch a more detailed video of his battle plan, seriously, the guy's crazy. But in a nutshell, his tactics saw him win the day, time and time again, even though he was severely outnumbered by multiple European nations trying to take him down. Well, it seems his luck had finally run out because at Waterloo, he received his first major defeat, and ever since that, well, he was kind of on the run. He was forced to retreat. They had him on the run. Eventually, he would surrender and was banished. He came back to be a tyrant and then was banished a second time, even harder. And France kind of went back to being France and not dictator France. Number 8, Jenkins Ear. The best way to describe life in the New World in the 18th century is aggressive corporate negotiations. The New World was full of plantations, trade, and YouTube's least favorite S word. So, also, naturally, the British Empire and its Royal Majesty wanted a slice of the Caribbean action. Trouble is, the Spanish had been there longer, and at the time, their presence was much more powerful. Well, the British had the means to de-Spanify the area, and all they really needed was a reason, because, you know, that makes war more palatable, right? Sure. Well, that's when they were presented with Robert Jenkins, a man who had his ear cut off by a bunch of Spanish thugs who raided his ship years prior. Turns out this was enough casus belli to start a war and fight over an ear. Hence the name in English, the war became the Battle of Jenkins Ear. That's so weird. That's so strange. Imagine a guy, right, he's got his ear lobbed off. Time to go, let's go. I guess that's the reason, sure. Well, how long ago did this happen? It was like 10 years ago. Right, good enough for us, get packing. Number 7, D-Day. June 6, 1944, Western Allies embarked on the journey that they have been striving for those many months. This plan amassed the largest amphibious attack in history, supported by a logistics operation large enough to supply a small country. Germany had constructed lines of defenses all along the coast of France. The Atlantic Wall, as it was called. It was going to be hard, and it was. American, British, and Canadian forces suffered many casualties, but after hours of fighting on the beach, they punched through and even further into German lines. Canadians making it the furthest on the first day. Why does this change everything? Well, because it gave Western Allies a massive forward operating base and a foothold in occupied Europe, effectively beginning to trap Germans between two large armies, the Western armies and the Soviet Union. Take that, Germany. Number 6, Stalingrad. All the way in the Eastern Front. None of this is pretty, but it's what happened. And no one paid the toll quite like the Soviet Union did. Germany marched into the Soviet Union by surprise, sending Stalin into a fit of rage. Germany got real close to Moscow, and in the process captured a stupid amount of POWs in the hundreds of thousands. It's crazy. However, when it came to Stalingrad, it wouldn't be so easy. A battle that lasted months. Civilians froze in the Russian cold and starved simply because the city was leveled, there was nothing left. After brutal urban combat, the Soviet Union began to push the Germans out, winning the Battle of Stalingrad, which honestly is more of a Pyrrhic victory, but this is when the Soviets began to reassemble their numbers, rebuild factories and buildings that had no walls or ceilings, and began the fight of pushing the Germans back to Berlin. It was the beginning of the end. Number 5, the Battle of Midway. Out in the Pacific Ocean, midway to Japan, one of the largest naval battles ever commenced. The Empire of Japan sent her best, as well as America sending hers. Aircraft carriers were sunk, planes at the bottom of the ocean, and when it was done, America was victorious. God bless America. More important than that, Japan had lost some of its key ships from its fleet and could no longer engage the US at sea in fear of losing what remained of their fleet. They just wouldn't match up. So Japan stopped in her tracks, dug in her heels in the middle of the jungles of the Pacific Islands, and dared anyone to come and find them. And that's just what the Marines were going to do, effectively beginning the island hopping campaign that the Pacific War became defined for.
Number 4, coldest winters. With the winter winds rolling in occasionally, soldiers could no longer play baseball outside and peg each other with baseballs, but what you could do was hit each other with snowballs. A little fun, also a little scary. They called it a snow battle. Yeah, a snow battle too. Battle, way more intense. Soldiers would leave with bruises, black eyes, and sometimes even broken bones. Yeah, these guys were blowing off lots of steam, and they would plan attacks and take it obviously seriously, as they did with their daily civil duties. Even officers got in on this action. When pieces of ice were no longer available to large units to throw at one's head, other winter games would include skating and...
Number 3, the Battle of Quebec. The 7 Years' War was interesting to say the least, and some consider it to be the first global conflict. Kinda is. While not talked about a lot, there actually was a lot of conflict in Europe at the time, especially between Austria and the other European powers. However, for history class, what's most studied is the conflict in North America. Basically, it was a fight over who got North America and or the territories that were owned by each other. That's pretty much what it was a fight over. And for French Acadians, the Battle of Quebec would decide it all. Unfortunately, it ended in English victory, a large portion of Acadians moving south to what is now Louisiana, and lines on the maps changing drastically. The early borders of both what would become America and Canada. It also helped set the stage for the American Revolutionary War. Also cool, because now we have America. And they're cool, I like America. I love you, America. Oh, say can you see? Number 2, the Battle of Okinawa. Years of island hopping and trying to dig out Japanese forces from the Pacific Islands had left its mark on everyone. By 1945, Japan was getting desperate. Very desperate. Supply lines were running thin. Men were also thin because of supply shortages, and well, there just wasn't enough manpower to fight the oncoming Americans. Seemingly at every tropical step America took, Japan met them with full force. Okinawa was no different and was the last island worth defending before mainland Japan. So they fought fiercely, no mercy, and when the Marines came out of the jungle they knew what was next. Or at least so they thought. And number 1, Pearl Harbor. This is the battle that changed it all, folks. Japan suddenly attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. Before this, America wasn't exactly neutral, as history tells it, as they had been supplying allies in Europe for cold hard cash, and they had embargoed Japan on their oil supply. So no, not exactly neutral. However, they were fully convinced that they were not going to get involved. They learned their lesson from the Great War and had no interest in sending young men to fight in what was going to be the worst conflict in human history. So yeah, it kind of brought America into the whole thing.
History is full of nearly forgotten battles that shaped where we are now. Obviously, I like to start with the ones that are more familiar story for us to warm up to. So that'd be how a teen solved an 100-year-old problem. That's right, Joan of Arc, baby. This delusional Bible thumper had visions of God and all sorts of beliefs that historians believe indicated hyper-religiosity, a psychiatric condition in which a person experiences intense religious beliefs or episodes that affect normal functions, logic, and behavior. Anyways, one day Joan heard the voices of a Christian saint telling her to aid Charles, the French Dauphin, in gaining the French throne and expelling the English. In May of 1428, she traveled to Vaucouleurs and told the captain of the garrison of her visions. He thinks she's nuts and sends her packing. But in January 1429, she annoys him enough to allow her passage to the Dauphin. Joan arrives in men's garbs with soldiers and has an audience with King Charles, who approves of her and set her off on her divine mission, rallying the citizenry, suggesting tactical decisions, and participating in battle. The French retook the banks of the Loire River and Orleans and defeated the invaders. Many say the battle saved France from centuries of English rule. Next up, let's meet the man who beat the Mongols. This is the Battle of Anjalou of 1260. The Mamluks ruled most of Egypt and the majority of the Fertility Crescent, so they were quite pissed when the Mongols came in and snatched Baghdad in 58. A year later, in 1259, the Mongols moved into Syria and Aleppo, at Damascus and Aleppo, and the shores of the Mediterranean. Naturally, they're feeling pretty confident, so they send an envoy to Cairo in 1260 and demand the submission of Sultan Muzaffar al-Din Quwad, whose reply was the execution of said envoy, and so the war was the only answer, I guess. With the army led by Quds, the Mamluks defeated a small Mongolian force at Gaza and then come up against an army of about 20,000 at Anjalou. This is where King David smoked Goliath in the Book of Samuels. No worries though, the Mamluks general was a former fugitive, he'd been in that area a lot, and reputed reputably drew up a battle strategy for the land, copying the Mongols' most successful tactic, feigned retreat. The strategy worked like a charm, and even when the Mongols swarmed from all sides, broke their left wing, the Sultan Qutuz tossed his helmet and screamed for the men to fight in the name of Islam and their love, a speech that motivates the men to gain the upper hand. The Mongol general is then taken prisoner by the Mamluks, and he declared defiantly that Khan would inflict savage revenge for this defeat, so they beheaded him on the battlefield. The remaining Mongols had began to retreat. The Mamluks pursued them for 8 miles to cut them down. The Mongol Empire was thus contained to Iran and Mesopotamia and spread no further.
Number 8. Bounty jumpers. Fewer than 150 Union soldiers were killed for desertion, and Lincoln was actually constantly writing letters and endorsements reducing soldier sentences from death to labor during the war. That's how bad it got. Deserters were a big problem for both the Confederate and Union armies, so it was punishable by death. After the Battle of Fredericksburg, the Union had 100 deserters roughly a day. That's a lot, every single day. The Union actually used peer pressure at one point just to keep soldiers from leaving. In 1863, the Union offered regiment perks if a certain percentage of original men were on for a following tour of duty. So soldiers inside were making others stay on board. How they did that, what they said, we don't know. Bounty jumpers were men who were paid to fill in the spot of newly drafted soldiers. So these guys would join for a few days and then desert them all over again and join a new post as the new substitute and get paid. And of course, some deserters were branded to avoid this problem.
How about a family at war? Cleo and the Ptolemies. We all know about Cleo's dramatic snake venom ending, but how about her bloody beginning? It starts when her father dies. Cleo's younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, is heir to the throne. Due to him being 11, a regent's appointed for him, who, with some other court officials, form a close-knit group with the young Ptolemy and feed him insecurity and conspiracy towards his sister, the ambitious and intelligent 18-year-old Cleo. What if she tried to usurp him for the crown after all? So in 48 BC, this group, fearful of her ambition and power, exiles her when she refuses to marry her younger brother. Cleopatra flees to Syria, intending to raise an army and return as ruler of Egypt. Julius Caesar calls these two siblings to his palace and tries to mediate. This is when Cleo gets the idea to seduce him and starts hooking up with Caesar. The two snatch the throne alongside her younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, and then much later after Caesar's slaying, when Cleo and her son Caesarion flee back to Egypt, Cleo then kills Ptolemy XIV, the other younger brother, so Caesarion can be on the throne. She also had a younger sister, Arinso, who helped conduct the siege of Alexandria against Cleo, so she killed her too in 41 BC. Naturally, this is when Mark comes in, stepping stone of the War of Atticum that lasted from 32 to 30 BC, where Octavian and Mark Antony duke it out over Roman Egypt. After a decisive win for Octavian, Cleo and Antony withdrew to Alexandria. Octavian besieged the city until both of them took their own lives, and Egypt was conquered. Now for the Silk Road Throwdown. Ever wonder why the Chinese philosophers were so incredibly talented and ingenuitive when it came to building weapons and machinery, creating things the Greeks and the Ottomans could only dream of, yet they didn't conquer more of the world? Few people today have heard of the Battle of Talas River. A double cross caused it. In 750, the king of Ferghana had a border dispute with the ruling neighbor of Chach. He appealed to the Chinese general Cao for assistance, and Cao besieged Chach and offered the Chachan king safe passage out of the capital. Once he did, he beheaded him. Naturally, news gets back to the Abbasid governor, who rallies the troops. Somewhere in present-day Kazakhstan, armies of the Abbasid Caliphate met those of the Chinese Tang dynasty. Chinese records state that the Tang army was 30,000 strong, while the Arab accounts put the number of the Chinese at 100,000. For 5 days, these mighty armies clashed. Then the Karluk Turks came in on the Arab side several days into the fighting, and the Tang's army's doom is sealed. Chinese sources imply the Karluks had been fighting for them originally, but treacherously switched sides midway through the battle. None of the combatants could have predicted that this battle would be instrumental in transmitting a key invention from China to the Western world, the art of papermaking, a technology that would alter world history forever. And did you guys know that this war was the first global conflict? The 7-Year War, colonizers fighting colonizers over land that isn't theirs to begin with. It starts with unresolved disputes. France claims Canada and the Great Lakes, and then the eastern seaboard was claimed by the Brits, who want more, and it causes skirmishes and political disputes. Meanwhile, Prussia preemptively annexed the state of Saxony in anticipation of war, which pisses off all of Europe and the Holy Roman Empire. Then the Russian Empire, fearing Prussia could turn on neighboring Poland and Lithuania, went against Prussia. 1756 saw the war officially declared against the French by the British, and now the 7-Year War began in earnest. Ironically, it's Russia's Empress Elizabeth dying that starts the end of the BS. Her successor pulls the Russian troops back and mediates the Prussia-Sweden truce. This is the same year Spain is pulled in on the French-Aussie side. Meanwhile, Britain is quite literally busy colonizing the ever-loving crap out of everywhere, while France was distracted from doing so. So they win India, the Philippines, Cuba, Galapagos, Guadeloupe, Martinique, and Senegal. In 1763, it was clear that Austria would not regain what they wanted from Prussia, which was its main goal throughout the war, so they just tapped out, and everyone just kind of stopped. The end of the war was the Treaty of Hubertsburg, signed on the 15th of February, and the Treaty of Paris, signed 5 days earlier. Essentially, to summarize, the treaties that they signed was everyone dividing up colonized land that didn't belong to any of them.
Number 4. Friendly fire. On the 6th of June, 1982, an incident occurred which claimed the lives of 4 British soldiers. Navy destroyer HMS Cardiff destroyed the friendly Gazelle helicopter. So what happened? How does something like this happen in the first place? Well, the HMS Cardiff was on lookout for Argentinian forces. Supplies coming into the Falklands Islands, of course, is a no-go. So on the night of June 5th, HMS Cardiff was stationed east of the islands, and at 2 a.m. they detected the British Gazelle helicopter, thinking that it was an attack. The helicopter was actually making a routine delivery with both equipment and soldiers on board. So what went wrong here? Well, first, after the Sea Dart missile was fired, the next morning it was assumed enemy fire was initially responsible. The Ministry of Defense stated they didn't want to cause further anguish to relatives while they were trying to piece together what went wrong, so it was a lot happening in one night. So some articles made it sound like they tried to hide it. It was really just they had their hands full and it was an accident. A lack of communication between the Army and the Navy was to blame, but not one individual per se, confirms the Board of Inquiry. The 5th Infantry Brigade had not notified anybody of the helicopter's flight, so it was a surprise to many, especially coming in at that speed to that location. The radar also doesn't look good at 2 a.m. when you see that blip coming in. And on top of that, the helicopter's identification friend or foe transmitter, the IFF, it was turned off at this point because it had previously interfered with the Army's anti-aircraft system. So it was just an accident.
Let's change history for the better. Cruelty to piety. In the words of archaeologist and scholar Ramesh Prasad Mohapatra, no war in history of India is as important either for its intensity or the results as the Kalinga War of Ashoka. No war in the annals of human history have ever changed the heart of a victor, from one of wanton cruelty to that of exemplary piety as this one. Enticed? You better be. In an attempt to conquer the southeastern and south parts of India, which would result in the Mauryan Empire becoming the largest empire in the country, Ashoka waged a war against the ruler of Kalinga in 261 BC. Kalinga had a sound geographical location with trade routes leading to South Asia, and import ports along a strong navy. A powerful state on the fringe of the Mauryan Empire would be problematic as it could disrupt the communication lines between the Mauryan capital and the Pataliputra and its holdings in the central Indian peninsula. The conflict spanned most of the Indian subcontinent, south of the Himalayas, and the coastal state of Kalinga, costing as many as 300,000 to 1 million lives. This had a shocking effect on Ashoka and makes him be the only would-be dictator. Oh my god, that's so itchy. The only would-be dictator on the verge of glory to just walk away. Ashoka devoted the rest of his life to non-violence and victory through karma as a Buddhist, ending the military expansion of the empire and beginning an era of more than 40 years of relative peace, harmony, and prosperity. In the long run, it did cripple the empire's ability to defend itself from external threats, one of the factors that led to the eventual fall of the Mauryan Empire following his death. But another inter-family battle with Macedonic madness, the Succession Wars. This family shows how a little nookie can go a long way. So Alexander the Great's father, Philip II of Macedon, probably had about 7 wives who all wanted to see their child installed on the throne, including Alexander's mother, Olympias. This starts the Succession War. Ancient historians are like 99.9% sure Olympias had something to do with Philip II's death via bodyguard in 1336 BC. Ancient historian Cleopatra also notes the bodyguard was a former lover of Philip II, who had taunted the king's newer younger lover into taking his own life. Yay. And Philip II's uncle-in-law allegedly forces himself on said bodyguard, making his brain kinda snap, and the bodyguard in retaliation kills his own ex, Philip II, in revenge. You following? It's believed Olympias is the one who snuck him into Philip's chamber. Whatever really happened, the Macedonian family's dysfunction doesn't end there. Alexander quickly started putting rival family members to death to secure his ascension, especially now that the throne was just wide open for the taking. And Olympias had Philip II's last wife, offspring, sneakily disposed of. After Alexander died in 232 BC, which might have been from alcoholism by the way, leaving a pregnant wife but no heir, his disabled half-brother is installed on the throne. The half-brother Philip III's wife, Eurydice, was essentially a beard for the mentally absent king and attempted to turn this figurehead into a real ruler. This put her in competition with Olympias. Ultimately, Philip is executed on Olympias' order, and then Olympias is caught and stoned to death by relatives of people she's killed, and this whole lineage came to a crumbling end. And to end it off, 2 battles, 1 won, one lost at the same time. An unnoble slaughter and the warring brothers. Plot A, Inca King Huayna Capac dies and decided to just leave his kingdom to his two sons, half-brothers Atahualpa and Huascar, who have zero in common and can't seem to lead together, so naturally, war! Okay, plot B. While the bros are duking it out with each other, an absolute scum of the earth colonizer named Francisco Pizarro heard the news of riches in the mountain. They send a messenger through to the emissaries of Atta, who at the time was sweeping the floor with his brother Hua. He accepted the proposal to meet the leader from a foreign land. Plot A again. In 1532, Atta's army finally defeats Hua's outside of Cusco. News of this victory reached Atta, who was in the city of Cajamarca. At the time, sightings of strange white-skinned men with wool on their faces were reported as well. This is where Atta, now king, had agreed to meet the foreigners. A and B plot now can join. Spaniards have surrounded the city with their weapons, and Atta brings 80,000 people alongside him, mostly unarmed. Hiding Spaniards send a friar to Atta, who doesn't speak a lick of any language but his own, and ask him to accept Christianity. Hand him a Bible. Naturally, he has no idea what he's doing, so he hands it back. Well, that means he doesn't accept Christianity, so he deserves to die, and so does everyone else. The Spanish descend on the vastly unarmed crowd and start cutting everybody down. The conquistadors captured Atta and held him for ransom, who still makes sure to tell everyone, yo, execute my brother, execute him. Atta wouldn't outlive Hua by much. The Spanish do execute him as well in 1533, even after the Incas paid the ransom. Because colonization has never been about spreading the good word of religion, it's always been about theft and greed. If these brothers hadn't been warring when the Spanish arrived, things would be very, very, very different now.
Number 10, D-Day, laying lots of pipe. D-Day was a day that the Allies had been preparing for so many years. June 6, 1944 was the beginning of the end for fascist tyranny in Europe. Composed of landing spots in Normandy, France, were Utah, Omaha, Juneau, that's ours, Gold, and Sword. The idea was to finally punch through the Mustache Man's Atlantic Wall and get a foothold in occupied Europe. Thousands of lives were lost in a matter of hours. Crazy battle. However, something I think is very interesting and a battle that no one really talks about is the logistics battle of D-Day. Seriously, the amount of stuff that had to happen or to be put in place in order for the invasion to commence was insane. One example of this is the pipeline that would fuel Allied vehicles once the invasion had been successful. Starting in 1942, the pipe was being laid. Eventually, it would extend over 100 miles into France and Europe to supply the war effort. Crazy what we'll do for a little gas.
Number 9. Battle of Zappolino. Turning the calendars back to 1325, the Battle of Zappolino was a large-scale event over a bucket. Like a pail, like a literal wooden, I'm not even joking here. The War of the Oaken Bucket, that's what it's also referred to as. This war consisted of two Italian towns, Bologna and Modena. They all went head to head, and it kicked off when soldiers from Modena snuck into Bologna with intentions to steal the town's wooden bucket from the city's well. How horrible is that? I mean, resources were pretty sparse back then, so this was actually like a really big deal to do that. The Bolognese declared war immediately and sent in an invading force of 30,000 foot soldiers and 2,000 cavaliers. The city of Medina had a smaller army. They had only 500 infantrymen and 2,000 cavalry forces. Thing is, these guys still won. They chased the larger army back to Bologna while destroying towns in the process. Some recall them bringing the bucket back just to taunt the city. They came back like, oh, you want this bucket, eh? And they started smacking it with spoons and they just left again. The bucket is currently and still on display in Medina. If you want to go see it, go take a look. That took so many lives. That many people kicked the bucket over this bucket. History is strange.
Number 8. French Indochina. The US was not the first superpower trying to tame Vietnam. Vietnam used to be called French Indochina, and it used to be a colony of France. And when they no longer wanted to be a part of that, France came down to give them a piece of their minds. But you can probably guess how that went, considering the US was there 20 years later trying to do the same thing. While France was trying to keep a colony and the US was trying to stop communism from spreading to other countries, Vietnam was trying to fight for its independence, which is ironic for America because that's how they became a country. And yes, I know that the communist movement in Vietnam wasn't great by any standards, but the regime America was trying to put in place was no better. As much as France would have liked to keep Vietnam, times were changing, and there was no victory in sight, with or without American support.
Number 7. Combat of the 30. Also known as Combat des Trente, you can say that if you're feeling fancy of course, but the Combat of the 30, easier for me to say, took place during the Breton War of Succession. This was back in 1351. This battle was arranged beforehand, you know, bring your shiniest armor and your most golden gal and meet me at the battlefield at Brittany. Throw a little note in, and then both sides had 30 champions. They had their best knights come forth in all the land, and they just fought it out. One side represents the King of England, the other the King of France. This whole thing was arranged by one guy, a captain in the French banner named Jean de Bonmanior. This event pulled in a crowd. Drinks were literally served throughout the audience. This fight lasted a very long time. Hours went by, and 4 French knights had fallen, as well as 2 Englishmen. So they started taking breaks. Yeah, like a common sporting event now. By the end of the whole thing, the English surrendered after losing 9 knights, and the French in total lost 6. And nobody tipped the servers. All bad.
Number 6, the battle for Castle Itter. Wehrmacht versus SS. May 5th, 1945 was the final act of WW2, or really the last few days in Europe. So, when American soldiers came across a Wehrmacht detachment defending an Austrian castle full of high-value targets from some other Germans who hadn't seen the big picture yet, yeah, it was going to be crazy. So the Americans joined forces with these renegade Germans to help defend the castle. I'm gonna call on Hollywood again here. Come on guys, this one just writes itself. The ensuing battle was very hectic as ammo was running dry and becoming something of a nail-biter, when finally reinforcements showed up to rescue the motley crew. What made Germans turn against Germans? Was it 5 years of WW2? Maybe it was hunger, grief, or maybe they were just fed up with Mustache Man. Either way, it makes for a great story and shows that not everyone is terrible. The enemy of mine enemy is mine friend.
Number 5, the Battle of Los Angeles. Of course we have to mention one of the most unspeakable battles of all time, the Battle of LA, otherwise known as the Great LA Air Raid. It happened during World War II at the end of February 1942. This event, first of all, took place only a few months after the Pearl Harbor attack, so everybody was obviously immensely stressed out. Something like 25 enemy aircraft was spotted flying over LA in the late hours of February 24th, so air raids went off. Blackouts were now in effect. This was not a drill, right? Or was it? Artillery fire, machine guns, anti-aircraft shells, in total around 1,400 shells were blasted off. 2 people had heart attacks. 5 people in total died from this retaliation, and it was indeed a false alarm. A press conference was held by Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, and he called the incident war nerves. Yeah, just nerves. Ha, whoopsies, thought I heard a noise. Oops, sorry about your heart attacks.
And now we'll be touring the tours. Be careful who you ally yourself with. Eudes the Great learned the hard way. Having been threatened by both the Arabs in the south and the Franks in the north, he forms an alliance in 730 with the Uthman Nasira, the Berber emir. Yeah, 1 year later, Uthman rebels against the governor, and the governor Abdir Rahman quickly crushed the revolt, executed everyone, and turned his focus onto anyone Uthman ever allied with. Oopsies, that's Eudes. So, the Duke had enough warning of the coming siege and collected his army at Bordeaux, but they were easily defeated, and Bordeaux plundered as well as areas of Gaul. Eudes then appeals to Franks for assistance, which Charles the Hammer Martel only granted after they agreed to submit to Frankish authority. Charles arrives at the battleground first in 732, and for 6 days the two armies sort of just watch each other with minor skirmishes. Rama's men wait for their full strength to arrive, and when they did, chaos ensued, but it only lasted 1 day. Apparently, a rumor reached the Arab army that Charles had sent scouts to cause chaos in the Muslim base camp. Charles's hope was to draw off part of the foe, and it succeeded. Tons of the Muslim cavalry booked it back to camp. To this, the rest of the Muslim army, it looked like a full-scale retreat was happening, so they all started running too. Then their leader, Rahman, gets killed. So how does this change history? Many scholars have argued that if Rahman had prevailed, which he would have without Martel's trickery, the dominant religion of Europe today would be Muslim.
Number 3, the War of Jenkins Ear. Not to be confused with the War of Holyfield's Ear, that was a bit more recent. The Jenkins Ear War took place in 1731, when a British trader, Robert Jenkins, was accused by Spanish authorities of being a smuggler. Reminder, this is 1731, so everybody was like, okay, you said it, therefore it must be the truth. And so they seized all his belongings, and to make matters somehow worse, they cut off his ear. Now cut to 8 years later, the British are now brainstorming, just looking for a reason to attack Spain and then, force them out of the Caribbean. So they launched this big attack and over 25,000 lost their lives. Disease was to blame for most of that body count, so if you're gonna avenge your ear, wash your hands. In the meantime, I don't know, just an idea.
Number 2, Navy cheese. I can't lie to you guys, there's a part of me that would love to get into a time machine and join the Royal Navy in its prime, sailing the sea for Her Royal Majesty and getting into naval battles, just like you see in the movies. Or me, Pirate Captain Chetty, imagine that. Would also be pretty sick, and Captain Chetty and maybe Helmsman McWaters. It's all fun and games until Wheels of Cheese start causing mortal wounds. Wait, what did I just say? Yeah, during a naval skirmish between Brazil and Uruguay, things were getting a little out of hand. Brazil, having the superior navy, wasn't worried. Who cares? And besides, the enemy had just run out of cannonballs. What could they do to us? Before they could bust out the champagne and celebrate, however, the Uruguay ship fired back with Wheels of Cheese. And it worked very well. It destroyed a lot more than the Brazilian ship would like to admit, and was forced to retreat. Getting destroyed by cheese is not going to look good on the report.
And finally, number 1, the Battle of the Stray Dog. I grew up with dogs my entire life. I love dogs, but it's stressful at times. You open the door to look at a mailman for a split second, and all of a sudden your furry friend is running down the street after a blue jay. It's not easy. Now I'm running in my socks at 9 a.m. It's no good for anyone. Since the Second Balkan War in the early 1900s, Greece and Bulgaria were going head to head. A lot of conflict, a lot of emotions, tensions are high. Come October 1925, things escalated and exploded. A Greek soldier was chasing after his dog, who just decided to bolt randomly, as dogs do, but in doing so, he accidentally crossed the border into Bulgaria, so he was shot at. The Greeks at that point were beyond upset, so they marched into Bulgaria, and so began a full-on war. By the time the International Committee negotiated a ceasefire to, clear up the obvious misunderstanding that happened here, 50 people had already lost their lives. So, keep those leashes on, folks. That's all I'm saying.
Number 10, the Swiss Last Stand. Guys, this list taught me a lot of things, but one thing stands out above the rest. We are so freaking soft, like so damn soft. I have never, nor will I probably, who knows, ever face certain death willingly, like these people did. Lutheran mercenaries on May 6, 1527 were pillaging across northern Italy, and finally they made it to Rome. They made straight for Vatican Hill, and Pope Clement VII was on the hit list. While he was being smuggled out of Rome, 189 Swiss guards stood up against 20,000 bloodthirsty and angry troops. They formed a fighting square, and based on numbers alone, what should have been a quick victory turned into an all-day battle. The Swiss troops managed to beat back wave after wave of troops. When their swords dulled, they fought with daggers. When the daggers got lost, they fought with fists and teeth. It just went on and on. Sadly, they were taken down to the very last man, but their perseverance and courage still stand against the test of time.
Number 9, the Battle of Hastings. Winding the clocks back to 1066 to the Battle of Hastings, this one went down in East Sussex, England, and it happened in the middle of October, so why not include this one in the list? This battle was fought between the Norman-French army of William, Duke of Normandy, and the English army under the command of King Harold Godwinson. This kicked off the Norman conquest of England. According to William the Conqueror, the previous king of England, Edward the Confessor, originally promised the crown to William. He promised him the crown, but right before he passed away, the guy was on his deathbed and he literally changed his mind. How rude. Instead, he passed the crown on to Harold Godwinson. So William, yeah, he was a tad upset at this point. So he and his forces defeated Godwinson, went right into London, and became England's first Norman king. Epic.
Off to visit our Nordic friends to learn how the Swede supremacy ended. Very few wars shook up the European power structure more than the Great Northern Wars of the 1700s, the whole purpose of which was the Baltic armies teaming up with the pure goal of ending Swedish reign in the region. Apparently they sucked and nobody liked them, but thank you for IKEA and the meatballs. Sweden beat all these armies repetitively until 1709. The Swedish invasion of Russia had already failed the previous winter from their loss of major supply column and their failure to receive expected reinforcements. Despite the severe shortages of troops, artillery, and powder, Charles continued the war and besieged Poldvala in May. Charles planned to charge past the Russian line of redoubts without stopping to subdue them and directly target the main Russian defensive position. This called for extreme mobility and daring, two things Charles didn't have since he was hella injured. The Swedish attack faltered and the Russian counterattack with 40,000 troops killed and captured the entire Swedish army, except for Charles and 1,500 followers who escaped. Charles was wounded wounded, and after the attack handed the command over to a subordinate, and a subsequent counterattack went terribly, resulting in the decimation of a third of Swedish armies, along with the loss of the battle, the war, and Swedish supremacy.
Number 7. The Siege of Orleans. 1429. This battle marked the first major military victory for the French Royal Army following their defeat 30 years prior at the Battle of Agincourt. The Siege of Orleans is noted mostly for the involvement of Joan of Arc. This was during the late stages of the 100-year War between England and France. For about 6 months, the English was winning, but 9 days after Joan of Arc's arrival, the siege collapsed. Joan of Arc was just 17 years old also during this battle. But even before this, when she was just 12 or 13, she started to hear voices apparently from God. She saw these visions as well, and during her trial, she testified that saints and angels told her to go to church, to live a good life, and to also establish Charles VII to the French throne and be the country's rightful king. Not a bad tip-off from the God Squad. Now, while she did command the army at a young age, Joan of Arc didn't actually participate in combat. She did outline strategies and inspire troops, and also she was famous for her temper. That's pretty epic.
Number 6, the Winter War. The Winter War during World War II is not spoken of often, despite it being kind of incredible. Stalin was looking to expand his territory and had long wanted a reason to take over Finland, and so they invaded. Vastly outnumbered and outgunned, Finland should have fallen, but they didn't. One reason is that they were fighting on their turf, and 2, a man named Simo Häyhä. Marshal Carl Gustaf Mannerheim created a complex network of concrete bunkers, trenches, and fortifications that discouraged tank attacks by the Russians. The Finnish also used their skis to take out men through like lightning fast hit and run attacks, but Simo Häyhä made the Soviets shake in their boots. He was credited for over 500 kills within 100 days, despite being a humble farmer. He became known as the White Death and was one of the reasons that in just 3 months, Russia suffered 300,000 casualties while Finland sat at 65,000. Wow.
Number 5, the Battle of Marathon. Every New Year's Eve, there's always a guy on Facebook who just becomes a runner all of a sudden. They have the squirt water belt, the whole thing, they train for a marathon. But what is a marathon? Was it a person? Is it just a name for 42 kilometers? Well, it was a battle back in 490 BC between ancient Greeks and Persian invaders sent by King Darius. The Persians arrived to Marathon, about 20,000 of them. They arrived to punish the Greeks for supporting the Lonians who revolted against the Persians. The Greeks were outnumbered greatly, but they attacked hard and fast, and they took out 6,000 Persians, and eventually they just fled entirely. The number of Greek fighters lost was only around 200, so far less casualties. The story of Philippides came to be at this time. He ran the first ever marathon. He ran all the way from Marathon to Athens to deliver messages. BBM wasn't a thing back then, so he just had to blow his kneecaps out 6 times a day. He was one of the Greek military men known as the day-long runners. He did 6 marathons back to back, basically. Meanwhile, my uncle on Facebook's like, #runnerlife. Okay, no, next, delete.
Number 4, Battle of the Marne. It's quite possible that World War I is the cause and effect for every major conflict since, and a lot of stuff on this list too. Some historians think that the Great War is responsible, so if that's the case, then look no further than the Marne. In a nutshell, European empires thought this war would just be a little titter-tatter, be home by Christmas sort of deal. They always say that. Well, after a bunch of maneuvering and meeting at the sea, the race to the sea as they called, it was time to ditch the blam-blams and reach for shovels and picks, as this is where everyone dug in and built trench systems that stretched miles, thousands of them. It would also be the start of the horrible trench warfare. All thanks to the Battle of the Marne.
We have to include one of the most important battles of World War II on this list. We've seen this one on screen now numerous times. Every time I watch Saving Private Ryan, I don't breathe for that entire beach sequence. I couldn't even imagine what that must have been like in real life. Beginning on June 6, 1944, 156,000 American, Canadian, and British troops arrived at 5 beaches along the coast of France's Normandy region. Before the invasion, the Allied forces made this large-scale campaign, a deceptive one in order to mislead the Germans. Come August, most of northern France was liberated, and not long after the Germans were defeated. Historians refer to this battle as the beginning of the end of the war in Europe. The late Ray Lambert, who recently passed in April at age 100, was an army medic during D-Day. His unit was sent to Normandy that June, and Ray Lambert saved 15 lives that day, despite having a broken back himself. He would drag injured men from the water to the secure small area behind this concrete block. He was 23 during D-Day as well. I'll save you the math. At the 75th anniversary ceremony of D-Day, that same block was named Ray's Rock and has a plaque on it honoring Lambert and his men.
Number 2, 300. Yeah, it was real. If you've seen the movie and the abundance of rippling pectorals, then you have heard of 300. But no, it wasn't just a movie, it happened, but the 300 was actually more like 4,000. But still, when you put it side by side to the massive hordes of enemies they faced, it might as well be 300. The Battle of 300 refers to the actual Battle of Thermopylae. King Leonidas was raised as roughly and brutally as depicted in the film, perhaps even harsher, so when horsemen from the east appeared in 481 BC as messengers from the god King Xerxes of Persia, he knew what he was to face. They demanded land and water, aka obedience to the empire, but instead of just Spartans, Athens and Sparta decided to form an alliance. It was suggested that they block the narrow passage, the hot gates, of the Thermopylae coast. The Spartans and Greeks faced over 150,000 Persian soldiers, and despite fierce fighting, they did lose. However, the battle remains one of the most famous in Greek history, not because they lost, but because of the testament of courage that stood against thousands.
And coming in at number 1, the Battle of Yorktown. Well, the surrender at Yorktown, rather. On this day, October 19, 1781, the Americans defeated the British at Yorktown, Virginia. British General Lord Cornwallis had to surrender about 8,000 soldiers, bringing an end to the American Revolution. Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury of the United States, famously killed in a duel with Aaron Burr. If you have Disney Plus, go watch the musical Hamilton, because you'll be dancing your way through history lessons in no time. According to historian and author of Alexander Hamilton, the formative years, Hamilton had a genius and was working hard, but did not come from an illustrious family like most of the founding fathers. He knew that winning glory in battle would make him famous and therefore help him further his career. Seriously, if you haven't seen Hamilton, I implore you to dive in tonight. It is the anniversary. What else do you have going on? Let's do it.
Number 10, Crying Wolf. The Gulf of Tonkin incident was a conflict between Vietnam and US forces in 1964. What's messed up about that is that 2 days later, it happened again. Actually, it didn't. Big prank. The second incident was fabricated by the US just to justify ramping up their presence in Vietnam. Sadly, it worked, as the next 8 years in Vietnam would end up being a total snipe storm for the US, as they would encounter problems abroad and at home. Thank goodness this is the only time the American government would ever lie about anything ever again, right? This was officially declassified decades later. Number 9, Agent Orange. The world agreed not to use chemical warfare after the First World War, as it was extremely cruel and lethal. So, you might be surprised that America used chemical weapons during the Vietnam War. Agent Orange, brought to you by the Dow Chemical Company, was a herbicide and defoliant dropped and sprayed from air vehicles to cut down the thick jungle brush. Viet Cong soldiers were excellent at living off the land and concealing themselves in the jungle. Bad guy hides in jungle, you remove the jungle. Makes sense. The chemical was extremely effective, but what's so messed up was the negative health side effects. Soldiers that were exposed to the chemical developed cancers years after the war. But what's even more crazy is how it affected the Vietnamese people. It created children with really bad health defects, and to this day there are many people who live with ill side effects of Agent Orange. That's just not right, man. That's wrong. That is so wrong, dude. Number 8, the Battle of Gettysburg. The North versus South. A house divided amongst itself cannot stand. One fighting for a noble cause, the other fighting for a, well, not so noble cause. Up until the Battle of Gettysburg, the South had been winning tactful battle after tactful battle. They were kind of good. General Lee of the Confederacy was making his invasion of the North very notable. However, on July 1st, 1863, that's a couple years before Canada was born, the Battle of Gettysburg commenced, the largest and most costly battle of the war. The thing is, this time, it was a Union victory, and the Union used this momentum to carry themselves all the way back down south, and eventually to victory. Number 7. Well, that escalated quickly. Up until 1967, the war was bad. But it was nothing compared to what was going to happen in 1968. In 1968, the Viet Cong launched the Tet Offensive, a massive military campaign designed to destroy the foreign invaders. All across the country, key targets were being attacked, and it seemed overnight that the war went from a 6 all the way to an 11. What's so messed up though is, even though the VC did not achieve major victories, it was costing a lot of American lives. With the Viet Cong using the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the war not only escalated in Vietnam, but had reached neighboring nations like Cambodia. This had an effect on the war back home. The US thought and told people it would be a quick war. They had the advantage. But after the VC flexing their military might, it was clear that more US soldiers would be needed to win the war, which some people were beginning to question in the first place. And as time went on, most people would protest America's involvement. Number 6. A terrible loss of life. The Vietnam War is one of the most important events in US history, and honestly world history too. It was a very hot war during the Cold War, which we could do a whole video on that itself. A time of superpowers ready to annihilate one another at the push of a red button. Thousands of young men volunteered or were drafted to fight in a war that would humble the very powerful country. 58,141 Americans would lose their lives in order to contain communism. Of that, 61% they were under the age of 21. That is an insane, I can't even believe that. The Vietnamese lost over 300,000 people in the conflict. The war is remembered for being a tragic loss of life, and the domino theory that communism would spread throughout the world if containment was not initiated didn't happen, as most countries today just aren't communist. Number 5. Civil rights. If you know the 1960s, then you know it was a decade of change. A lot of history to unfold in just 10 years. Again, we could probably do a whole video on that. The Vietnam War is especially important towards the civil rights movement, as black Americans were a big part of the war effort in Vietnam. Black soldiers were nothing new to the American military, but their integration with white soldiers was. Every war previous, soldiers of different skin color were separated into different units. While most soldiers got along, there was still a long way to go, as black soldiers were still often mistreated. It seemed, however, that in a war zone, white Americans and black Americans were fine, but at home had tensions. We could do a whole video on civil rights and segregation, but to sum it up, racial relations made Americans ask questions. And for black Americans, the question is, how is someone expected to fight a war in a foreign country that we really have no business being in, for a country that won't allow a certain group of citizens to even buy a cup of coffee because they're not allowed to enter the building due to the color of their skin? Just doesn't make sense, man.
At number 4, pure vengeance. Just to give you guys an idea as to how ruthless Genghis Khan and the Mongol army were, let's talk about that one time they killed 1.7 million people just to avenge one person. We just talked about how the Khan would marry off his daughters to secure power, but that doesn't necessarily mean there was no love in the marriage. One of Genghis's daughters really loved her husband, and when he was killed by an archer, she was devastated. Genghis actually really liked his son-in-law as well, so they were both shaken by his tragic death, and they swore vengeance on the person who killed him. Genghis Khan and his army traveled to the place where the archer who killed Khan's son-in-law lived, and they wreaked havoc on every person there. The Mongols killed every person in that city. It is estimated that the death toll was around 1,748,000 people. By request of the Khan's broken-hearted daughter, every man, woman, child, and even animal was killed, beheaded, and their skulls were placed into pyramids to make sure that not a single person got away with just a simple wound. She really said full send or no send.
Number 3. I love the smell of napalm in the morning. Another very useful tool in destroying the Vietnamese jungle. Trees are made of wood, and wood burns, so set them ablaze. Except napalm is different. A chemical compound meant to burn at a very hot temperature of 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, and it would burn for a while. This was used in multiple ways, but probably the most effective with airstrikes. While not the first time firebombing had been used, as it was proven effective in the firebombing of Japan during World War II, the Vietnam War saw almost the same amount of ordnance dropped, napalm and others included, as used in all of World War II by America. That is an insane statistic. It had a terrible effect on people, as it can burn skin off. The most infamous picture from the Vietnam War had something to do with this. We can't show it to you, but you've probably honestly seen it already. The military would later disband its use, as the ability to control napalm's destructive power is limited. Number 2. GI Kebab. While the Viet Cong may not have won many battles against the US, they were still formidable fighters. They had the lay of the land and laid traps everywhere. From 1965 to 1970, 11% of American casualties were related to Viet Cong placed traps. What's so messed up in that is that in a modern war with modern technology, a lot of the traps the Viet Cong were using were something out of the Stone Age, but still deadly. Improvised explosives, swinging spiked balls, tripwires, single shot cartridges, and snake pits right out of Indiana Jones. I can't even believe that's real. But the most effective were punji pits, or punji sticks. A large hole is dug and bamboo spikes are placed at the bottom. Then, out of pure evil, urine or human excrement is put on the spikes. A thin layer of leaves or cover is placed on the trap, so when someone comes along they would fall in a pit of spikes, that if that didn't kill him, an infection from the waste would, or make recovery very, very miserable. That is cruel, man. That ain't right, man. That ain't right, Chief. Number 1. Apocalypse Now. Tiger Force was a long-range reconnaissance unit that later became known for its acts of war crimes. Not sure if there could be war crimes when everyone's doing naughty things, but okay. To quote Martin Sheen in Apocalypse Now, charging someone with murder around here is like handing out speeding tickets at the Indy 500. And like a scene right out of that movie, the members of Tiger Force had a tradition to make necklaces out of ears. I'm going to say that again. They made necklaces out of ears. There are a number of things Tiger Force committed that are honestly just not safe for life. But that's war at the end of the day. War is hell. Number 10, the Pig Wars. If there's one thing Americans love besides Dunkin' Donuts, I mean, I'm just assuming because your commercials tell me that America runs on Dunkin's. If it's not that, it's Manifest Destiny. It seems the second the founding fathers and patriots won their freedom, they wanted just a wee bit more and took over what is now the United States of America from coast to coast. Thing is, Britain was also still there in a land known as Canada, or actually British North America, or Rupert's Land if you went to Canadian history class. The British were doing the same thing and expanding westward. They both got to the Pacific West Coast and everything was cool, kosher, great. Well, except for some islands not too far from the mainland. It was heavily debated on who actually owned these islands. Well, it almost turned into another global war. Both Americans and British were living on the island. When a British-owned pig had gone one step too far and eaten out of an American field, the pig paid the price with his life, causing tensions to escalate to the point where the Navy and high-ranking officers got involved. Ooh, not good. Partially being stoked by an American who to this day, no one knows the method to his madness, but apparently he was looking for a fight regardless. Kind of a weird story. All over a pig. Jeez. Number 9, the Anglo-Zanzibar War. One day a disgruntled nephew got rid of his uncle and took the Zanzibar throne for his own. Classic story when it comes to royals, that's what they do. Naturally, the British who said dibs on Zanzibar were not all too pleased, as they had someone else in mind for the throne. Someone who would let them in and keep empiring as they do. So this angry nephew said, "Nah, I don't think so, fam. Ain't having that," and he started to organize the troops, and in a nutshell said, "You know what, why don't you come on in and try and stop me, you and one army?" Well, it was the British Army. They did, and it's been recorded as the shortest conflict in human history, lasting only 45 minutes. The nephew escaped to the German embassy and the British moved in. The rest is colonial history. What a great story.
At number 8, death toll. When you think of Genghis Khan and his spree of violence and chaos, you might think to yourself, yeah, he killed a lot of people, but you never really realize just how many lives Genghis and his army took until you really put it into perspective. Let me compare the destruction that Genghis and his army caused to another historical figure who was responsible for the deaths of a lot of people, Joseph Stalin. This man was responsible for the deaths of over 20 million people, making him single-handedly more brutal than the German soldiers from World War II. But if you think that's bad, then think again, because Genghis Khan was much, much worse. Genghis and his army were responsible for an estimated 40 million deaths. They wiped out entire cities in some of the most brutal ways you could think of. Now that's pretty messed up. Imagine being a member of Khan's army and having to basically kill anyone in sight. Can't get any more messed up than that, right? Well, maybe it can, but you'll just have to keep watching to find out.
Number 7, the Emu War. Say what you will about country folk, but when small town folks band together as one, anything can be accomplished. Well, let's take a trip down under so I can talk about the Emu War. The Great Depression was tough. That was the case for Australian farmers. It was actually a little extra hard for them too. Unfortunately for the farmers, they also had an emu problem. Large birds eating and destroying their crops. I mean, they're massive. You see an emu, they're like this big, they're huge. The government in all her powerful glory decided to step in and lend a hand. They sent out soldiers with trucks and machine blam blams. So obviously the people got rid of the emus, right? It makes sense. There's armies here, we're gonna get rid of them, no problem. Well, no. What should have been an easy work unfolded into the Emu War. Weeks of trying to hunt down the pesky emus. It was somewhat ineffective. One politician joked that emus should be awarded medals for their bravery in standing up to the soldiers. That's just crazy. That's just, wow. Number 6, World War I. While there are many factors that led to World War I, and some that you might not hear in the classroom, but in a nutshell, new technology, militarism, imperialism, and a general distaste for each other were all thrown into a pot. she was turned on high, and when Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo, she was turned on high, really hot, when Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo. A lot of people will tell you that's where it started, and they're not wrong. However, there was a lot of miscommunication and correspondence that had to happen between the empires first. In a series of very tragic events, leaders were on vacation, didn't get messages, people sat on war declarations, and before peace could be made, people were pointing fingers and playing the blame game, which is pretty much what got boots on the ground. And or to the grounds. Wasn't good. So in a nutshell, World War I was started by miscommunication. That's kind of awkward. Number 5, World War II. Well, surely after the most destructive conflict in human history, we wouldn't be so keen on another, right? Well, wrong. That could be the point right there, but the unusual event that started World War II was nothing. Just like that episode of Seinfeld. It was a war about nothing, George. I don't know. Well, not true, but let me explain. The factors leading up to World War II were all there. Fascism, communism, imperial expansion, again, revenge, unification. However, honestly, like a bunch of bad parents letting their kids get away with anything, nobody really did anything to stop Mustache Man. They used a policy called appeasement, which basically meant he wants something, he gets it. He wants something, he gets it. Not a great system. Okay, you can have that country, but no more. That's it. We appeased you enough. Oh, okay, you can have that one, but next time no more. That's it for real. Oh, fine, you can have that one too, but now I'm putting my foot down. And after 4 or 5 countries fell to Mustache Man, that's when they finally did something. So really, it was neglect. Number 4, Jenkins Ear.
Number 4, Bannockburn. King of the Scots Robert the Bruce versus King Edward II of England, June 23rd, 1314. The First War of Scottish Independence. The infamous battle between Scotland and England was one of the most important battles of the Middle Ages. The end of a bloody war for independence. Long story short, Scots were like, yeah, we're gonna stay here and just continue to roll our R's. The gruesome wooden wars were caused by the English invading Scotland in 1296. Basically, he was like, bow and say I'm king, or good night. Well, a young warrior, William Wallace, guardian of King of Scotland himself, didn't really like that idea too much, and instead decided to hold off the English forces and was knighted a hero of Scotland. Although the bloody battle wasn't the end, it was definitely the most significant. Unfortunately, like every hero back then, he was also someone's villain. William was captured, hanged, drawn, and quartered. The battles between Scotland and England ended in 1328, 14 years later, with Robert the Bruce securing Scotland's independence and adding like 34 more dialects to the UK. Freedom!
Number 3, the War of the Bucket. Modena and Bologna, 2 warring Italian city-states. One sponsored by the big man in the big hat, which is the Pope as they call him I think, and the other was the Holy Roman Emperor. Big power struggle. Who's in charge? I don't know. This was kind of the way it went in ye olde medieval Europe. However, in 1325 it began to get a little spicy, as both Modena and Bologna would make a day out of raiding each other's cities, because even though we're pretty similar, we'll just attack each other, because yeah, sure. However, it got real serious when Bologna's bucket went missing. Oh! It started a war, and the real ironic thing is it might not have been stolen at all and just blamed in confusion of a missing bucket. Modena steals a bucket, we gotta get him. How dare you take my bucket? It's kind of like when your sibling takes your favorite toy. You did what to my action figure? You know what I mean? Number 2, the console war. My generation probably remembers the PS3 versus Xbox 360 war. I'm pretty sure Chris remembers that. He does. See? But the real one was Sega versus Nintendo in the 90s. Well, how did it start? Okay, well, Nintendo was on a huge roll. Super Mario, Metroid, Zelda, you couldn't stop them. That wasn't until the Sega Genesis released with the edgiest blue hedgehog ever to grace your old TVs. Millions of dollars in smear campaigns, Genesis does what Nintendo doesn't. I'm sure you guys all remember that commercial. It was a really powerful commercial. I learned about it in business class, so there you go, look at that. And number 1, the Russo-Japanese War. This one's crazy. How about a war, cause it'll make us look cool, said the advisors to Tsar Nicholas II, worried the Russian Empire didn't look so cool anymore because it's been failing for a while. And in a classic schoolyard tactic, let's find the weakest link and start there. Well, they thought it was Japan, but as it turns out, Japan wasn't that guy, pal. He's not that guy, pal. And they won, so very surprising literally everyone. So not only did a massive European power start a conflict with a puny island nation for bragging rights, but they also lost that war to a puny island nation for bragging rights. That's just crazy.
Number 10, 3 fights and a funeral. This first point is still up for debate, as many historians are still trying to confirm how this whole gladiator thing started, but one possible launching point for these bloody Olympics was a blood rite at funerals. They served as a kind of violent eulogy, so instead of standing up in front of the mourning families and reading, I don't know, like a haiku or a poem, they fought out their feelings. Healthy. When esteemed aristocrats died, families would hold bouts between slaves beside the grave, like right there. Front row seat for the corpse. This was to demonstrate the virtues that were demonstrated by the dead in life. This presentation of blood in battle also could have stood in for human sacrifice. As you can guess, the tradition would gather quite the crowd and eventually evolved into the epic gladiator battles we know today. Julius Caesar, for instance, organized a massive gladiator fight between hundreds of warriors to honor the death of his father. By the end of the 1st century BC, the gladiator games were state-funded and much, much larger.
Number 9. No heckling. When the Colosseum was built in 80 AD, about 50 to 80,000 fans of Roman combat, they would pour in. The energy was high. This was their only source of entertainment, really. They weren't watching The Witcher Season 2 back then, so you know, they had to do this. So some fans would get so into the action that they of course would heckle. Well, just like a comedy show, they too can hear you heckle. You're throwing off their entire performance, and that's a no-go. Today, a 21-year-old usher will politely ask you to keep it down, but in Roman Colosseum days, you don't get a warning. One of Rome's more violent emperors, Domitian, was pretty die-hard when it came to the Colosseum and the games. So much so that one day, a guy in the crowd heckled a gladiator, probably talked smack about his oiled up abs, or you know, smile, that's always a fun one, we hear that a lot. So Domitian had him pulled from the audience to the center of the arena where a group of aggressive dogs finished him off. How terrifying is that? No heckling, ever, even now, stop.
Hey Taylor!
Yeah?
Stop!
Number 8, the HMS Plymouth. Just because an explosive is a dud does not mean that it's not going to set everything ablaze. The HMS Plymouth is a Rothsay class frigate named of course after the English city, and it served the United Kingdom's Royal Navy from 1959 to 1988. This warship has since been decommissioned and opened to the public, but finally scrapped in 2014. The HMS Plymouth was one of the first Royal Navy ships to arrive in the South Atlantic once Argentine forces invaded the Falkland Islands. Plymouth, the Antrim, Brilliant, and Endurance all combined forces to recapture South Georgia on April 28th. This was Operation Parakeet. On June 8th, during the Bluff Cove air attack, Plymouth was hit from the skies, but the 4 explosions did not go off. They were all duds. One of them ended up hitting the flight deck, detonating a depth charge, and a fire broke out. But none of them really went off, you know what I'm saying? 5 men were injured on the Plymouth, but later on, in the wardroom of the ship, was where the surrender of the Argentine forces was signed by Lieutenant Commander Alfredo Aaste. So there's a lot of history in that one ship. Number 7, death before combat. With most of these Roman gladiators, they are trained, they understand a specific style of combat, and they're paired off with an opponent that's somewhat equal. But not all of these gladiators are UFC fighters. Not all of them are Russell Crowe, okay? A great amount of gladiators were criminals who were forced to fight each other in the name of entertainment. These prisoners of war were not really on board with fighting a lion with a dagger. They understood that this was probably a one-way trip, so many of them took their own lives before the combat even began. This one story is haunting, but it makes total sense. 29 prisoners were all set to fight these crazy animal battles in front of thousands, but they all ended up strangling each other. They took each other's lives because that was easier to them than walking into this nightmare. That's horrible. The reason this was an easier choice to make was because saying no would lead to an even more painful and still public execution.
Number 6, aphrodisiac. The fanaticism around gladiator warriors was like the fanfare around the Beatles, the Stones, and Justin Bieber, like all around, all combined. You might even argue that they were some of the very first celebrities, and that was mostly due to their sex appeal. They were sex bombs. Ooh ooh. Beefy men. Yeah. Roman women believed that even their sweat was an aphrodisiac, like Old Spice deodorant. The gladiators won massive fame and even had their own action figures, as children would make their clay dolls emanating their favorites. Their image would be placed on walls in public spaces and even endorsed products. Women wore hair jewelry dipped in gladiator blood or mixed their sweat into hair cream or cosmetics. To have a dream about one was said to foretell a fortunate marriage. There was even graffiti in Pompeii that depicted one fighter who would catch women in his nets at night, like a sexy boogeyman. Ooh!
Number 5. Blindfolded. Remember that last scene in the movie Dodgeball when Vince Vaughn blindfolds himself and then still wins somehow? What a moment in time. There were no dry eyes in the entire theater. But what if I told you gladiators would also pull this trick off? Yeah, in order to get crowds to return to these massive death events, they would need to change the formula up from time to time. Sometimes they would have cheap beer nights, which helped, but a new idea that worked was referred to as andabada, where gladiators wore blindfolds during combat. They would also leave the armor inside, yeah, sometimes just battling in sandals and cloth. And you thought Marco Polo made you anxious? They would save these events for the more brutal criminals, so people weren't just forced to, wrap up their eyes and shake their legs into an arena. It was, they were bad, so it's kind of like, it was fine, I guess.
Number 4, the Battle of Waterloo. Fun fact, in grade 10, my classmate and I reenacted the Napoleonic Wars with breakfast sandwiches that we made and brought to class. We got an A. Anyways, the Napoleonic Wars lasted between 1803 to 1815 and led to the deaths of over 5 million people. But after only 9 hours of bloodshed next to the Belgian town of Waterloo, the world changed forever. This moment in history marked the end of Napoleon's attempt at conquering Europe. On June 18th, 1815, Allied forces composed of British, Dutch, Belgian, and German thwarted Napoleon's attack. Thanks to them, Napoleon was left singing, "Waterloo, I was defeated and you won the war." ABBA. It paved the way for the powers today, lending a pathway for the British to become a global power, good and bad. Demand for American war supplies was crucial during the Napoleonic Wars as they remained neutral. Britain somewhat got in the way of the trading, but the Europeans' need for American cotton and grain became a higher importance, therefore establishing America as like a power. Now there was a lot of bloodshed behind the scenes here, as we know from colonialism in general, though it is clear that this battle changed the course of history for more good and bad to arise.
Number 3, nets for weapons. When you're walking into that arena, you're eyeing down this 8'6" beast in front of you. He has like 12 abs. It doesn't look good. His name's Gore or something terrifying. You're gonna want a Nerf bat or two. You're gonna want a weapon. Now, weapons in the Colosseum were a necessity, of course, but can you believe some gladiators would use nets to fight? Nets. Yes. Yeah, nets, like they're catching butterflies or co-hosts. This class was referred to as the Rhetari. Now their combat style was built around the ways of fishermen. Yeah, Popeye versus Maximus. Place your bets, people. Realistically, these warriors looked a lot more like Aquaman. They would fight with a trident and a net. They would take their time. They would avoid these mighty swings from these big dudes. And then when the time was right, they would just go zzz, and then they would just poke the shit out of them with a trident over and over in hopes that it would, end. It helps to be quick, but if you've seen Game of Thrones, you know that spears don't always work.
Number 2, are you not entertained? Great title, I know. Fun fact, gladiators for the most part didn't actually try and kill each other in the ring, just like wound. Yeah. Take a second to digest that beside the Hollywood movies you know and love. But the truth was, gladiators had a code they had to follow, and killing each other wasn't a part of it. Why? Well, because gladiators were expensive investments, and seeing your prize fighter that you've forked hundreds and thousands of dollars into die in a fight would hurt your wallet big time. Also, most of them knew each other and were besties, so they didn't even want to. Contests were usually single combat between 2 even opponents, and referees oversaw the whole thing. If one got injured enough, the ref would probably just, call it. Often enough, the bout would end after both participants gave an entertaining show and would leave with honor. They were like, yeah, you're entertained, good, we're good to go, right? Cool. However, their life expectancy was still short. Historians estimate that gladiators had 1 in 5 or 1 in 10 chance of ending up dead after the bout, either from being killed or wounded, gangrene, you know the whole deal.
And finally, coming in at number 1 spot, naval battles. Okay, so I mentioned the Aquaman gladiators with the nets and the, pokey poke tridents. That's absolutely insane, but have you heard about the staged naval battles? What a spectacle this would have been. The Colosseum was once flooded, which I'm sure took a hot minute or two. Then these ships would come out, and then it would be like medieval times, but with a splash zone, right? These ships were designed to resemble these vessels from famous battles, but the bottom of the ship was flat because the water was only 5 feet deep. Can't have the bottom of the ship scraping against all that sand and bones and stuff. No, you'll get stuck. The water was only 5 feet deep, so obviously they couldn't use real ships. It wasn't always violent reenactments either. Sometimes they would fill the Colosseum and nude synchronized swimmers would come out. Nice, nothing like an in-ground pool filled with gladiator bones. Also, goggles weren't invented until the 14th century, so yuck. These naval battles were doing so well that Emperor Domitian devoted an entire lake to them. It's kind of like Harry Potter Goblet of Fire. They would just go to this lake and then watch these insane battles or performances, you know? Hashtags Slytherin, I don't know. Once the shows moved over there permanently, they then used the floodgates and trapdoors to hide animals inside of. What a nice upgrade. What a show. Also, this is terrifying. Drew. Kicking off the list at number 10, A Day in the Life. So as soon as the sun came up, your life as a Civil War soldier began. You would train day in, day out, preparing for battle. It was important that each soldier knew their role to work together as a unit. Now, I would say that there's no time for fun and games, but they always made time to blow some steam off. In between drills, soldiers would do chores just like we do every day. They would cook meals, do laundry, clean gear, and make sure that everything is smooth. Passing the time was done by playing dominoes or poker. Reading was of course a popular way of passing the time as well, but it was a lot harder to get your hands on a book back then, especially when you're running around between marches and battles. So more often than not, soldiers would trade newspapers with their opponents. You would hear about the Christmas peace treaty, but this would happen as well. They would just trade papers. A soldier named Milton Barrett, stationed in the 18th Georgia Volunteers, wrote about this back in 1863. He said, "Our regiment had just come off picket. We stood close together and could talk to each other. Then when the officers were not present, we exchanged papers and bartered tobacco for coffee." They would do it when the officers weren't looking. That's the most intriguing part. They would manage this by using a small boat. Tricky, always a way. The first aerial photograph was back in 1860. James Wallace Black took this photo not by using drones or any bowling alley crazy technology we have today, but rather just a hot air balloon. This lovely landscape is the town of Boston, and you're looking at it from 2,000 feet. This was a long time before selfie sticks. Even longer before that, hot air balloons were being used in warfare. The first account of a hot air balloon being used was The first account of a hot air balloon being used in war was 1794, when the French Committee of Public Safety created the Corps d'Astrociers, which is a hot air balloon squad. They were used in the Battle of Charleroi and Fleurus, and then 70 years later, they were used in the American Civil War. They were pretty large as well. They could fit around 5 guys, where smaller balloons like the Eagle and Excelsior only carried 1 soldier. Those were for stealth flights. That'd be pretty brave. Imagine seeing a hot air balloon coming over the horizon and it has soldiers shooting at you. That's incredible. I didn't hear about any of this growing up. They could reach up to 1,000 feet, so they definitely had a vantage point like no other, and they would communicate with soldiers on the ground using flag signals or of course telegraphs. The most successful balloon program in the Union was under the command of Thaddeus Lowe. He and Lincoln were allies, and Lowe actually sent a telegraph to Lincoln once describing the view of Washington from above. Call your friends more and describe your view to them. You might get a few things done.
Number 8. The Third Servile War. No, not the Civil War, the Servile War. Oh. AKA the Gladiator War. I'm Spartacus. No, I'm Spartacus. Okay, yeah, we get the reference, but who really was this guy? Well, he was a Thracian gladiator who, along with 4 others, was the escaped slave leaders in the Third Servile War, a major slave uprising against the Roman Republic. The third, actually. Yeah, people were pissed at slave labor. They were done. At first there was about 70 men, then that grew to an aggressive 120,000 escaped, trained, pissed off gladiator slaves. Yeah, that's absolutely terrifying. The Roman Senate's growing alarm about the continued military successes of this growing army led to Rome's army of 8 legions under the leadership of Marcus Licinius Crassus. With help of Pompey, of course, the war ended in 71 BC when, after a long and bitter fight, the Roman legions absolutely crushed them. Yeah, sorry Spartacus. He's a hero though. This rebellion is just one example of oppressed people fighting for their freedom against the oppressors. The Third Servile War was the last of the Servile Wars, and Rome would not see another slave uprising of this type again, as the impact had changed Rome forever.
Number 7. Daily diet. These soldiers were all around 25 years old. The minimum age to join, of course, was 18, but a lot of these guys who were that young would often lie about their age anyways on paper. So on paper, the average was 25 years. But these guys were kids, basically. They ate mostly crackers, and when I say crackers, I don't mean the salty work snacks that you have today. These were made of like flour and water and just salt called hardtack. They would eat berries, nuts, and fruits. Anything they could find is all they had. Most of these soldiers were close to starving to death. Number 6. Soldiers protest. 1/3 of the Union soldiers were immigrants, and 1 in 10 were African American, and those soldiers actually refused their salaries for 18 months to protest being paid lower wages than white soldiers. When black soldiers were signing up in the Union Army in 1863, they were only getting $10 a month, while white soldiers were getting around $13 a month. Officers were getting $700 a month too. It was just insane. To make things even worse, black soldiers were then hit with a $3 monthly cleaning fee, bringing that down to $7 a month now. So a protest was in order and it was held for 18 months, and then come September 1864, black soldiers received equal pay that was retroactive to their enlistment date, so they finally were able to send money back to their families after that long. Number 5. Passing time. You would assume the Civil War and being part of it and everything I've talked about would give you enough anxiety, but gambling was also a common pastime in between battles. And when I say gambling, I don't mean, okay, it's nighttime, let's throw a few bucks down and play dominoes. No, they would gamble on everything. Horse races, chess, euchre, poker, checkers, cards were popular until the end of the Civil War, when of course they were harder to come by, being so flimsy and all. And when dominoes and cards were out of the picture, soldiers would really go old school and play leapfrog. Yeah, games like that were literally all they had. They would wrestle each other for fun, they would have foot races and bet on them. Bowling would be played using cannonballs to knock down wooden pins, and baseball was also played, but it was a little different back then to how we remember it now. The ball was a lot softer, and there was sometimes only 2 bases. The only way you were out also was if you were hit by the ball, hence the softness that I mentioned.
Number 4. Women fought as gladiators. This was news to me. I wouldn't do it because tiny. As we might have already established, gladiators were usually built from slaves, warriors, and sometimes even volunteers. Good for you. And apparently women were not exempt from that. Female slaves were quite frequently condemned to face their fate in the arena, though some volunteered because, you know, there were Xena warriors. Some of the time it was as genuine contenders, while some were sent simply for the entertainment or embarrassment. Emperor Domitian, for example, loved to pit women against people with dwarfism because he thought it was funny. Neither the women or the little people were taken seriously, as few appeared to have proven themselves in combat. However, some still did, rest assured. The timeline as to when they started doing this is unclear, but there are records of at least 2 women referred to as Amazon and Achillea. Epic names, right? Whoa. They are depicted on a marble relief dating back to the 2nd century AD, and it says that they fought in an honorable draw. Women also joined in the animal hunts, but by 200 AD their participation ended when Emperor Septimus Severus banned them in the games. Damn you, Severus Snape!
Flooding. Number 3. Food March. In April 1863, a group of mostly women led a march to get the governor's attention. The governor at the time, John Letcher, was joined by President Jefferson Davis. It did not end well. The food situation in the South was not great because food prices changed depending on the status of the war. Outcomes of the battle directly affected prices because they were linked to the CSA's currency. That plus the fact that invading troops from the north would often burn crops when they came through, it was getting worse over time. Come April 1863, this march of women broke windows. They flipped carts until eventually they drew out Governor John Letcher and President Jefferson Davis. John Letcher literally started to throw cash at the protesters. Now they still didn't stop, obviously, that didn't solve problems. It was so bad that the militia almost had to open fire. Number 2. The alligator. I mentioned soldiers and hot air balloons, so I must mention the United States Navy's first submarine. How fun. This 47-foot long submarine that was paddle powered, yep, you heard me, paddle powered, so you'd be inside and you would do this. We can't call it the USS Alligator because it technically didn't see any active days of combat. In fact, the Alligator, that's what I'll call it, had to be cut loose on its first mission. It was being towed behind the USS Sumter on April 2nd, 1863, right off North Carolina when bad weather hit. The Alligator went down and we haven't found it since. It's still out there. The alligator is still lurking out there. Only a few months after this new weapon went down, the Confederate States of America launched their own sub, the H.L. Huntley, and it sank the USS Housatonic near the coast of Charleston, officially marking the first time a submarine sank an enemy ship. It also immediately sank afterwards, taking the lives of 8 crewmen, so even in victory, you're not safe. They made history but only enjoyed it for minutes. This is all tragic. Number 1. The wage gap. Hundreds of women joined the Civil War and they did so by looking like men. Yeah, they would pull a she's the man and get to work. But the thing is, like I mentioned before with the CSA's currency being affected by the status of the war, soldiers were getting $13 a month roughly. That's double what a woman could make anywhere on the planet, so they really had no choice but to join. This was long before women's suffrage, so if they thought you were a man, you could use that $13 how you wanted. So it comes to no surprise that women would keep this disguise even after the war ended. In 1909, the US US Army officially denied that any woman was ever enlisted in the military service of the United States as a member of any organization of the regular or volunteer army at any time during the period of the Civil War. During the Civil War though, that was the first time in American history when women all came together in a war effort. Thousands of women from the North and South volunteered as nurses.
At number 10, Silver Eyes. After learning a little bit about Genghis Khan, I'm starting to catch on to this my way or the highway kind of attitude he had. Khan didn't like it when people would go against his orders, and he did not give second chances to people. If you wronged him, he would end you. Simple as that. One of the more gruesome examples from Khan's past comes from when he tried to set up a trade route with a leader of a large city. Genghis sent 500 troops to start this trade route, but the city leader had the whole caravan that Genghis sent completely wiped out. Now, as I mentioned before, Genghis Khan has a my way or the highway kind of attitude, and if someone went against him, there would be hell to pay, and boy oh boy, was there hell to pay for this one. In retaliation, Genghis and his troops went to pay this city leader a visit and ended up killing the entire civilian population of the area. Of course, he had to save the best for last and killed the city leader by having his troops pour molten silver into the leader's eyes. That's pretty messed up, not only to carry out that order, but also watch something as horrendous as that happen right before your eyes. At number 9, Noble Blood. Even though Genghis Khan was this big, scary, ruthless killing machine, he still had rules that he liked to follow. One of those rules he established for himself and his army was a rule that prohibited noble blood from being shed. This meant that when Genghis and his army conquered a new place, they would kill anyone, but they wouldn't slash, stab, or maim the nobility who lived there. But just because their blood wasn't spilled doesn't mean that they didn't get to face harsh consequences. Instead, Khan's army had to come up with new creative ways of ending the lives of the nobility without bloodshed. If a nobleman was lucky, then they would have just had their necks snapped, but this method of execution was quite rare. The army did, however, find enjoyment out of suffocating their victim to death. Imagine having to come up with an appropriate method of ending someone in just a few seconds. Before we carry on talking about the wild things that Genghis Khan made his army do, why not leave a like on this video if you're enjoying it so far, and while you're at it, consider subscribing to the channel to see more videos like this one.
Number 8, vegetarians. So believe it or not, the diet of a gladiator was largely vegetarian, though it wasn't really like they had any choice. It was expensive to keep these fearsome warriors, and meat wasn't always easy to come by, so they had to fill in the gap with other sources. Based on the excavation of 22 gladiators, their bones revealed that their typical food was wheat, barley, and beans. How they could tell this from their bones, no idea. Science, man. There was little sign of any meat or even dairy as well. However, they did drink another kind of mysterious substance. This study was carried out by the Medical University of Vienna in Austria and the University of Bern in Switzerland. And not only did it reveal the aforementioned vegetarian diets, it also showed evidence that they consumed a health-boosting tonic made out of plant ashes. It can be compared to the way we consume magnesium tablets or vitamin C. It was believed that it helped restore gladiators after a battle. Now obviously 22 is a pretty small sample size, but hey, that's still at least that percentage, so.
At number 7, Skilled Archer. Genghis Khan wanted as many people to fight for him as possible. I mean, the guy's army was huge, and as I mentioned previously, he left a lot of destruction in his wake. When he conquered a new place, he gave some people the option of joining his army or facing the consequences, but he also liked to hire people for the unique skills. That's how one of his enemies turned into one of Khan's best archers for his army. While in battle, Khan encountered an incredibly skilled archer from an enemy clan. This archer saw Khan on the battlefield, and instead of being afraid of him, he was obsessed. He was Genghis Khan's biggest fan, although he did almost kill Khan with his arrow. The Mongols sent the enemy clan running for the hills except for the archer, who bravely marched into the Mongol camp and asked to speak to the Khan. He then explained that he was the archer who nearly shot him and that he was willing to pay for his crime with his life, though he also added that if the Khan were to spare him, he would become his lifelong servant and join his army. Now, I don't know what kind of brainwashing had to have happened for this archer to willingly join Khan's army, but either way, it's a little messed up. At number 6, body shields. When in battle, one of the most important things to have is protection. Armor, weapons, and shields are necessities when fighting opposing forces, but you know, Genghis had to go and make this concept weird. As Genghis and the Mongols entered battle after battle and conquered city after city, they would often take the opposing clan's soldiers as prisoners. These prisoners didn't just sit around in holding cells though, they were put to good use. These captured soldiers would join the battle with the Mongols and were often used as human shields. The prisoners would be told to fight their best on the battlefield, and if they succeeded and survived, and the Khan deemed them worthy, they would be able to join the Mongol army. Now I don't know what's more messed up, the fact that the Mongols were just okay with having literal human shields, or the fact that the prisoners would go through with this brutality in order to join the Khan's army. I guess it just comes down to survival, but what do you guys think? At number 5, family affair. For a long time, and sometimes even still today, marriages were used as a means to seize power and status. Genghis knew this could work in his family's favor, and so he came up with a strategy to seize power by using his own children. Genghis was known to marry off his daughters to the kings of his own allies, but it was a complex plan. In order to have the privilege of marrying one of the Khan's daughters, the king would first have to cast aside all of his other wives to make sure that his daughter was the only one. Not because he wanted his daughter to be in a completely monogamous marriage, but so that there was no other competition. The kings would then be sent into battle, and since almost everyone would die in battle, the power of the throne would be carried over to the king's wife, in this case being a daughter of Genghis Khan. This strategy worked so well that by the time Genghis died, his daughters ruled an area stretching from China's Yellow Sea to Iran's Caspian Sea.
1731, Britain. They were looking for an excuse to attack Spain. After all, they've got a lot of loot and gold, and come on, that belongs to Britain. It's gonna go in our museum, come on, that makes sense. They had just about run out of hope until Jenkins walked into the room. Sounds like a joke, but it's true. Jenkins was an English sailor who had gotten into a confrontation with Spanish authorities 8 years prior. Sadly for Jenkins, it cost him his ear. They took off his ear, because that's what you do back then. And as soon as the British caught wind of his ear, well, it was on. So yes, they did start a war over a man's missing ear, because it's a good reason to steal gold.
At number 3, Victory Feast. I think it might be safe to say that the Mongols were sore winners. They really rubbed it in their enemies' faces that they had lost and that Genghis was victorious. One of the best examples of the Mongol army taking their victory a little too far comes from when they defeated the Russians in the Battle of the Kalinga River in 1223. After Genghis and his troops were victorious in their battle, they decided to hold a celebratory feast. The Mongols forced the captured Russian nobility to lie down on the ground, then a heavy wooden gate was thrown on top of them, then the tables and chairs were set up on top of them, and the Mongols sat down to a feast, all while slowly crushing the Russians to death under the weight of their celebratory shindig. I mean, I can only imagine the painful screams that would have echoed through the party atmosphere as the troops sat down to their meal. It must have been a horrifying experience, or maybe their screams were like their version of a Spotify dinner playlist. At number 2, erased from history. As I've mentioned before, Genghis didn't like taking no for an answer, and just to show how displeased he was about not getting his way, things were known to get quite violent. Genghis once staged an attack, and when defeated, he asked the Zizia kingdom to send him troops, as if he was entitled to that, right? Anyways, when they refused, Genghis got really mad and sent his army to attack, giving orders to literally kill and destroy everything. The Mongol army said, okay bet, and destroyed everything that belonged to the kingdom and systematically wiped out every member of the kingdom's population. At the end of it all, the Zizia kingdom was literally erased from history. They didn't write down their own stories, so the only reason why historians know of their existence was from records of other kingdoms. It wasn't until 700 years later that their language was rediscovered, when in the 20th century archaeologists found stones with their writing on them. Even though Genghis Khan died during this battle, the Mongols were so dedicated to their leader and the cause that they carried on their mission without him, killing every person in the kingdom even after their kingdom's leader had fallen and their enemy had surrendered. And finally, at number 1, buried secrets. The Mongols, though a large army, were very good at keeping secrets, because after the Khan died, they never revealed where their leader's final resting place was. It was Genghis Khan's wish to be buried in a place where no one would be able to find him, and so to honor his wishes, the Mongol slaves took Genghis's body into the wilderness and buried him in an unknown location. To make sure that there was no way for them to share the location of Genghis's body, the Mongol army killed the slaves who buried their leader and threw them into the grave. They then planted trees on top of the grave to make sure that it blended in with the wilderness. But just to add insult to injury, when those troops made it back to the camp, they were also killed, so that the secret of where everyone was buried really remained a secret. It's kind of messed up that these troops killed each other just to keep a secret, but clearly it worked, because to this day, no one knows where Genghis Khan was buried.